Welcome to this compilation of 5 strange and mysterious sci-fi short stories. I'll be narrating And It Comes Out Here by Lester Del Rey, Yesterday House by Fritz Leiber, Beyond the Wub by Philip K. Dick, Psychotennis Anyone by Lloyd Williams, and The Crystal Circe by Henry Kuttner. For full science fiction novels and ad-free and audio versions of short stories and compilations, subscribe to my Patreon at patreon.com/stories from the skies SFF. But for now, sit back, relax, and enjoy. And It Comes Out Here by Lester Del Rey. Narrated by William Skye. There is one fact no sane man can quarrel with. Everything has a beginning and an end. But some men aren't sane, thus it isn't always so. No, you're wrong. I'm not your father's ghost, even if I do look a bit like him. But it's a longish story, and you might as well let me in. You will, you know, so why quibble about it? At least you always have, or do, or will. I don't know, verbs get all mixed up. We don't have the right attitude toward tenses for a situation like this. Anyhow, you'll let me in. I did, so you will. Thanks. You think you're crazy, of course, but you'll find out you aren't. It's just that things are a bit confused. And don't look at the machine out there too long. Until you get used to it, you'll find it's hard on the eyes, trying to follow where the veins go. You'll get used to it, of course, but it will take about 30 years. You're wondering whether to give me a drink as I remember it. Why not? And naturally, since we have the same tastes, you can make the same for me as you're having. Of course we have the same tastes. We're the same person. I'm you 30 years from now, or you're me. I remember just how you feel. I felt the same way when he, that is, of course, I, or we, came back to tell me about it 30 years ago. Here, have one of these. You'll get to like them in a couple more years. And you can look at the revenue stamp date if you still doubt my story. You'll believe it eventually, though, so it doesn't matter. Right now you're shocked. It's a real wrench when a man meets himself for the first time. Some kind of telepathy seems to work between two of the same people. You sense things. So I'll simply go ahead talking for half an hour or so until you get over it. After that you'll come along with me. You know, I could try to change things around by telling what happened to me, but I, told me what I was going to do, so I might as well do the same. I probably couldn't help telling you the same thing in the same words even if I tried, and I don't intend to try. I've gotten past that stage in worrying about all this. So let's begin when you get up in half an hour and come out with me. You'll take a closer look at the machine then. Yes, it'll be pretty obvious it must be a time machine. You'll sense that too. You've seen it. Just a small little cage with 2 seats, a luggage compartment, and a few buttons on a dash. You'll be puzzling over what I'll tell you, and you'll be getting used to the idea that you are the man who makes atomic power practical. Jerome Boel. Just a plain engineer, the man who put atomic power in every home. You won't exactly believe it, but you'll want to go along. I'll be tired of talking by then, and in a hurry to get going, so I cut off your questions and get you inside. I snap on a green button and everything seems to cut off around us. You can see a sort of foggy nothing surrounding the cockpit. It is probably the field that prevents passage through time from affecting us. The luggage section isn't protected, though. You start to say something, but by then I'm pressing a black button and everything outside will disappear. You look for your house, but it isn't there. There is exactly nothing there. In fact, there is no there. You are completely outside of time and space, as best you can guess how things are. You can't feel any motion, of course. You try to reach a hand out through the field into the nothing around you, and your hand goes out all right, but nothing happens. Where the screen ends, your hand just turns over and pokes back at you. Doesn't hurt, and when you pull your arm back, you're still sound and uninjured. But it looks frightening, and you don't try it again. Then it comes to you slowly that you're actually travelling in time. You turn to me, getting used to the idea. So this is the 4th dimension? You ask. Then you feel silly because you'll remember that I said you'd ask that. Well, I asked it after I was told, then I came back and told it to you, and I still can't help answering when you speak. Not exactly, I try to explain. Maybe it's no dimension, or it might be the 5th. If you're going to skip over the so-called 4th without travelling along it, you'd need a 5th. Don't ask me. I didn't invent the machine and I don't understand it. But I let it go and so do you. If you don't, it's a good way of going crazy. You'll see later why I couldn't have invented the machine. Of course, there may have been a start for all this once. There may have been a time when you did invent the machine, the atomic motor first, then the time machine, and when you closed the loop by going back and saving yourself the trouble, it got all tangled up. I figured out once that such a universe would need some 7 or 8 time and space dimensions. It's simpler just to figure that this is the way time got bent back on itself. Maybe there is no machine, and it's just easier for us to imagine it. When you spend 30 years thinking about it, as I did, and you will, you get further and further from an answer. Anyhow, you sit there, watching nothing all around you, and no time apparently, though there is a time effect back in the luggage space. You look at your watch and it's still running. That means you either carry a small time field with you, or you are catching a small increment of time from the main field. I don't know, and you won't think about that then either. I'm smoking and so are you, and the air in the machine is getting a bit stale. You suddenly realize that everything in the machine is wide open, yet you haven't seen any effects of air loss. Where are we getting our air, you ask, or why don't we lose it? No place for it to go, I explain. There isn't. Out there is neither time nor space, apparently. How could the air leak out? You still feel gravity, but I can't explain that either. Maybe the machine has a gravity field built in, or maybe the time that makes your watch run is responsible for gravity. In spite of Einstein, you have always had the idea that time is an effect of gravity, and I sort of agree still. Then the machine stops, at least the field around us cuts off. You feel a dankish sort of air replace the stale air, and you breathe easier, though we're in complete darkness except for the weak light in the machine, which always burns, and a few feet of rough dirty cement floor around. You take another cigarette from me and you get out of the machine just as I do. I've got a bundle of clothes and I start changing. It's a sort of simple, short-limbed one-piece affair I put on, but it feels comfortable. I'm staying here, I tell you. This is like the things they wear in this century, as near as I can remember it, and I should be able to pass fairly well. I've had all my fortune, the one you make on that atomic generator, invested in such a way I can get it on using some identification I've got with me, so I'll do all right. I know they still use some kind of money, you'll see evidence of that. And it's a pretty easygoing civilization from what I could see. We'll go up and I'll leave you. I like the look of things here, so I won't be coming back with you. You nod, remembering I've told you about it. What century is this anyway? I told you that too, but you've forgotten. As near as I can guess, it's about 2150. He told me, just as I'm telling you, that it's an interstellar civilization. You take another cigarette from me and follow me. I've got a small flashlight and we grope through a pile of rubbish out into a corridor. This is a sub basement. We have to walk up a flight of stairs, and there is an elevator waiting, fortunately, with the door open. What about the time machine, you ask? Since nobody ever stole it, it's safe. We get in the elevator, and I say first to it. It gives out a coughing noise, and the basement openings begin to click by us. There's no feeling of acceleration, some kind of false gravity they use in the future. Then the door opens, and the elevator says first, back at us. It's obviously a service elevator, and we're in a dim corridor with nobody around. I grab your hand and shake it. You go that way. Don't worry about getting lost, you never did, so you can't. Find the museum, grab the motor, and get out. And good luck to you. You act as if you're dreaming, though you can't believe it's a dream. You nod at me, and I move out into the main corridor. A second later, you see me going by, mixed into a crowd that is loafing along toward a restaurant or something like it, that is just opening. I'm asking questions of a man who points, and I turn and move off. You come out of the side corridor and go down a hall, away from the restaurant. There are quiet little signs along the hall. You look at them, realizing for the first time that things have changed. Stationery Fountain, Zergat Dispensary. The signs are very quiet and dignified. Some of them can be decoded to stationery shops, fountains, and the like. What a Zergot is, you don't know. You stop at a sign that announces, Travel Bureau, First Class, Tours Mars, Venus, and Trojan planets. Special rates to Owl Suns within 60 light years. But there is only a single picture of a dull-looking metal sphere with passengers moving up a ramp, and the office is closed. You begin to get the hang of the spelling they use, though. Now there are people around you, but nobody pays much attention to you. Why should they? You wouldn't care if you saw a man in a leopard skin suit. You'd figure it was some part in a play and let it go. Well, people don't change much. You get up your courage and go up to a boy selling something that might be papers on tapes. Where can I find the Museum of Science? Down here, Ryan, turn left for the sign. Stu Bloss, he tells you. Around you hear some pretty normal English, but there are others using stuff as garbled as his. The educated and uneducated? I don't know. You go right until you find a big sign built into the rubbery surface of the walk. Museum of Science. There's an arrow pointing and you turn left. Ahead of you, 2 blocks on, you can see a pink building with faint aqua trimming, bigger than most of the others. They are building lower than they used to, apparently. 20 floors up seems about the maximum. You head for it and find the sidewalk is marked with the information that it is the museum. You go up the steps, but you see that it seems to be closed. You hesitate for a moment then. You're beginning to think the whole affair is complete nonsense and you should get back to the time machine and go home. But then a guard comes to the gate. Except for the short legs in his suit and the friendly grin on his face, he looks like any other guard. What's more, he speaks pretty clearly. Everyone says things in a sort of drawl with softer vowels and slurred consonants, but it's rather pleasant. "Help you, sir? Oh, of course. You must be playing in Atoms and Axioms. The museum's closed, but I'll be glad to let you study whatever you need for realism in your role. Nice show. I saw it twice." "Thanks," you mutter, wondering what kind of civilization can produce guards as polite as that. I'm told I should investigate your display of atomic generators." He beams at that. "Of course." The gate is swung to behind you, but obviously he isn't locking it. In fact, there doesn't seem to be a lock. "Must be a new part. You go down that corridor, up 1 flight of stairs and left. Finest display in all the known worlds. We've got the original of the first 13 models. Professor Jonas was using them to check his latest theory of how they work. Too bad he could not explain the principle either. Someone will, someday, though. Lord, the genius of that 20th century inventor. It's quite a hobby with me, sir. I've read everything I could get on the period. Oh, congratulations on your pronunciation. Sounds just like some of our oldest tapes." You get away from him, finally, after some polite thanks. The building seems deserted and you wander up the stairs. There's a room on your right filled with something that proclaims itself the first truly plastic diamond former, and you go up to it. As you come near, it goes through a crazy wiggle inside, stops turning out a continual row of what seem to be bearings, and slips something the size of a penny toward you. "Souvenir," it announces in a well-modulated voice. "This is a typical gem of the 20th century, properly cut to 58 facets, known technically as a Jaeger diamond, and approximately 20 carats in size. You can have it made into a ring on the 3rd floor during morning hours for 1/10 credit. If you have more than one child, press the red button for the number of stones you desire." You put it in your pocket, gulping a little, and get back to the corridor. You turn left and go past a big room in which models of spaceships, from the original thing that looks like a V2 and is labelled First Lunar Rocket, to a 10-foot globe complete with miniature mannequins, are sailing about in some kind of orbits. Then there is one labelled Weapons, filled with everything from a crossbow to a tiny rod 4 inches long and half the thickness of a pencil, marked Final Hand Arm. Beyond is the end of the corridor and a big place that bears a sign, Models of Atomic Power Sources. By that time, you're almost convinced, and you've been doing a lot of thinking about what you can do. The story I'm telling has been sinking in, but you aren't completely willing to accept it. You notice that the models are all mounted on tables, and that they're a lot smaller than you thought. They seem to be in chronological order, and the latest one, marked 2147, Rinks Dynapatty, is about the size of a desk telephone. The earlier ones are larger, of course, clumsier, but with variations, probably depending on the power output. A big sign on the ceiling gives a lot of dope on atomic generators, explaining that this is the first invention which leaped full-blown into basically final form. You study it, but it mentions casually the inventor, without giving his name. Either they don't know it, or they take it for granted that everyone does, which seems more probable. They call attention to the fact that they have the original model of the first atomic generator built, complete with design drawings, original manuscript on operation, and full patent application. They state that it has all major refinements, operating on any fuel, producing electricity at any desired voltage up to 5 million, any chosen cyclic rate from direct current to 1000 megacycles, and any amperage up to 1000, its maximum power output being 50 kilowatts, limited by the current carrying capacity of the outputs. They also mention that the operating principle is still being investigated, and that only such refinements as better alloys and the addition of magnetric and nucleatric current outlets have been added since the original. So you go to the end and look over the thing. It's simply a square box with a huge plug on each side, and a set of vernier controls on top, plus a little hole marked in old-style spelling, "Drop BBs or wire here." Apparently that's the way it's fueled. It's about 1 foot on each side. Nice, the guard says over your shoulder. It finally wore out one of the cathode grids and we had to replace that. But otherwise it's exactly as the great inventor made it, and it still operates as well as ever. Like to have me tell you about it? Not particularly, you begin, and then realise bad manners might be conspicuous here. While you're searching for an answer, the guard pulls something out of his pocket and stares at it. Fine, fine. The mayor of Alta Sicaba, Centaurian, you know, is arriving. But I'll be back in about 10 minutes. He wants to examine some of the weapons for a monograph on Centaurian primitives compared to 19th century man. You'll pardon me? You pardon him pretty eagerly, and he wanders off happily. You go up to the head of the line, to that Rinks Diner Patter, or whatever it transliterates to. That's small, and you can carry it, but the darn thing is absolutely fixed. You can't see any bolts, but you can't budge it either. You work down the line. It'd be foolish to take the early model, if you can get one with built-in magnetic current terminals, Ehrenhaft or some other principle, and nuclear binding force energy terminals, but they're all held down by the same whatchamacallem effect. And finally, you're right back beside the original first model. It's probably bolted down too, but you try it tentatively, and you find it moves. There's a little sign under it, indicating you shouldn't touch it, since the gravistatic plate is being renewed. Well, you won't be able to change the time cycle by doing anything I haven't told you, but a working model such as that is a handy thing. You lift it. It only weighs about 50 pounds. Naturally, it can be carried. You expect a warning bell, but nothing happens. As a matter of fact, if you'd stop drinking so much of that scotch and staring at the time machine out there now, you'd hear what I'm saying and know what will happen to you. But of course, just as I did, you're going to miss a lot of what I say from now on, and have to find out for yourself. But maybe some of it helps. I've tried to remember how much I remembered after he told me, but I can't be sure. So I'll keep on talking. I probably can't help it anyhow. Preset, you might say. Well, you stagger down the corridor, looking out for the guard, but all seems clear. Then you hear his voice from the weapons room. You bend down and try to scurry past, but you know you're in full view. Nothing happens, though. You stumble down the stairs, feeling all the futuristic rays in the world on your back, and still nothing happens. Ahead of you, the gate is closed. You reach it and it opens obligingly by itself. You breathe a quick sigh of relief and start out onto the street. Then there's a yell behind you. You don't wait. You put one leg in front of the other and you begin racing down the walk, ducking past people who stare at you with expressions you haven't time to see. There's another yell behind you. Something goes over your head and drops on the sidewalk just in front of your feet with a sudden ringing sound. You don't wait to find out about that either. Somebody reaches out a hand to catch you and you dart past. The street is pretty clear now, and you jolt along with your arms seeming to come out of the sockets, and that atomic generator getting heavier at every step. Out of nowhere, something in a blue uniform about 6 feet tall and on the beefy side appears, and the badge hasn't changed much. The cop catches your arm and you know you're not going to get away, so you stop. You can't exert yourself that hard in this heat, fellow, the cop says. There are laws against that without a yellow sticker. Here, let me grab you a taxi. Reaction sets in a bit and your knees begin to buckle, but you shake your head and come up for air. I left my money home, you begin. The cop nods. Oh, that explains it. Fine, I won't have to give you an appearance schedule, but you should have come to me. He reaches out and taps a pedestrian lightly on the shoulder. Sir, an emergency request. Would you help this gentleman? The pedestrian grins, looks at his watch and nods. How far? You did notice the name of the building from which you came, and you mutter it. The stranger nods again, reaches out and picks up the other side of the generator, blowing a little whistle the cop hands him. Pedestrians begin to move aside, and you and the stranger jog down the street at a trot, with a nice clear path, while the cop stands beaming at you both. That way it isn't so bad, and you begin to see why I decided I might like to stay in the future. But all the same, the organised cooperation here doesn't look too good. The guard can get the same and be there before you. And he is. He stands just inside the door of the building as you reach it. The stranger lifts an eyebrow and goes off at once when you nod at him, not waiting for thanks. And the guard comes up holding some dinkus in his hand about the size of a big folding camera, and not too dissimilar in other ways. He snaps it open and you get set to duck. You forgot the prints, monograph and patent applications, he says. They go with the generator. We don't like to have them separated. A good thing I knew the production office of Atoms and Axioms was in this building. Just let us know when you're finished with the model and we'll pick it up. You swallow several sets of tonsils you had removed years before, and take the bundle of papers he hands you out of the little case. He prompts you for some more information, which you give him at random. It seems to satisfy your amiable guard friend. He finally smiles in satisfaction and heads back to the museum. You still don't believe it, but you pick up the atomic generator and the information sheets, and you head down toward the service elevator. There is no button on it. In fact, there's no door there. You start looking for other doors or corridors, but you know this is right. The signs along the halls are the same as they were. Then there's a sort of cough and something dilates in the wall. It forms a perfect door and the elevator stands there waiting. You get in, gulping out something about going all the way down, and then wonder how a machine geared for voice operation can make anything of that. What the deuce would that lowest basement be called? But the elevator is closed and is moving downward in a hurry. It coughs again, and you're at the original level. You get out, and realize you don't have a light. You'll never know what you stumbled over, but somehow you move back in the direction of the time machine, bumping against boxes, staggering here and there, and trying to find the right place by sheer feel. Then a shred of dim light appears. It's the weak light in the time machine. You've located it. You put the atomic generator in the luggage space, throw the papers down beside it, and climb into the cockpit, sweating and mumbling. You reach forward toward the green button and hesitate. There's a red one beside it, and you finally decide on that. Suddenly, there's a confused yell from the direction of the elevator, and a beam of light strikes against your eyes with a shout punctuating it. Your finger touches the red button. You'll never know what the shouting was about, whether they finally doped out the fact that they'd been robbed, or whether they were trying to help you. You don't care which it is. The field springs up around you, and the next button you touch, the one on the board that hasn't been used so far, sends you off into nothingness. There is no beam of light, you can't hear a thing, and you're safe. It isn't much of a trip back. You sit there smoking and letting your nerves settle back to normal. You notice a third set of buttons with some pencil marks over them. Press these to return to yourself 30 years, and you begin waiting for the air to get stale. It doesn't, because there is only one of you this time. Instead, everything flashes off and you're sitting in the time machine in your own backyard. You'll figure out the cycle in more details later. You get into the machine in front of your house, go to the future in the sub-basement, land in your backyard, and then hop back 30 years to pick up yourself, landing in front of your house. Just that. But right then, you don't care. You jump out and start pulling out that atomic generator and taking it inside. It isn't hard to disassemble, but you don't learn a thing. Just some plates of metal, some spiral coils, and a few odds and ends. All things that can be made easily enough, all obviously of common metals. But when you put it together again, about an hour later, you notice something. Everything in it is brand new, and there's one set of copper wires missing. It won't work. You put some number 12 house wire in, exactly like the set on the other side, drop in some iron filings and try it again. And with the control set at 120 volts, 60 cycles and 15 amperes, you get just that. You don't need the power company anymore. And you feel a little happier when you realize that the luggage space wasn't insulated from time effects by a field, so the motor is moved backward in time somehow, and is back to its original youth, minus the replaced wires the guard mentioned, which probably wore out because of the makeshift job you've just done. But you begin getting more of a jolt when you find that the papers are all in your own writing, that your name is down as the inventor, and that the date of the patent application is 1951. It will begin to soak in then. You pick up an atomic generator in the future and bring it back to the past, your present, so that it can be put in the museum with you as the inventor so you can steal it to be the inventor. And you do it in a time machine which you bring back to yourself to take yourself into the future to return to take back to yourself. Who invented what? And who built which? Before long, your riches from the generator are piling in. Little kids from school are coming around to stare at the man who changed history and made atomic power so common that no nation could hope to be anything but a democracy, and a peaceful one, after some of the worst times in history for a few years. Your name eventually becomes as common as Ampere or Faraday, or any other spelled without a capital letter. But you're thinking of the puzzle. You can't find any answer. One day you come across an old poem, something about some folks calling it evolution and others calling it God. You go out, make a few provisions for the future, and come back to climb into the time machine that's waiting in the building you had put around it. Then you'll be knocking on your own door 30 years back, or right now from your view, and telling your younger self all these things I'm telling you. But now, well, the drinks are finished. You're woozy enough to go along with me without protest, and I want to find out just why those people up there came looking for you and shouting, before the time machine left. Let's go.
Yesterday House by Fritz Leiber. Narrated by William Skye. Meeting someone who's been dead for 20 years is shocking enough for anyone with a belief in ghosts. Worse for one with none. Part 1. The narrow cove was quiet as the face of an expectant child, yet so near the ruffled Atlantic that the last push of wind carried the Annie O its full length. The man in grey flannels and sweatshirt let the sail come crumpling down and hurried past its white folds at a gait made comically awkward by his cramped muscles. Slowly the rocky ledge came nearer. Slowly the blue V inscribed on the cove's surface by the sloop's prow died. Sloop and ledge kissed so gently that he hardly had to reach out his hand. He scrambled ashore, dipping a sneaker in the icy water, and threw the line around a boulder. Unkinking himself, he looked back through the cove's high-end rocky mouth at the grey-green scattering of islands and the faint dark line that was the coast of Maine. He almost laughed in satisfaction at having disregarded vague warnings and done the thing every man yearns to do once in his lifetime, gone to the farthest island out. He must have looked longer than he realised, because by the time he dropped his gaze, the cove was again as glassy as if the Annie O had always been there. And the splotches made by his sneaker on the rock had faded in the hot sun. There was something very unusual about the quietness of this place, as if time, elsewhere hurrying frantically, paused here to rest, as if all changes were erased on this one bit of earth. The man's lean, melancholy face crinkled into a grin at the banal fancy. He turned his back on his new friend, the little green sloop, without one thought for his nets and specimen bottles, and set out to explore. The ground rose steeply at first, and the oaks were close, but after a little way things went downhill, and the leaves thinned, and he came out on more rocks, and realised that he hadn't quite gone to the farthest one out. Joined to this island by a rocky spine, which at the present low tide would have been dry but for the spray, was another green, high island that the first had masked from him all the while he had been sailing. He felt a thrill of discovery, just as he'd wondered back in the woods whether this might not be the first human feet to kick through the underbrush. After all, there were thousands of these islands. Then he was dropping down the rocks, his lanky limbs now moving smoothly enough. To the landward side of the spine the water was fairly still. It even began with another deep cove in which he glimpsed the spiny spheres of sea urchins. But from seaward the waves chopped in, sprinkling his trousers to the knees, and making him wince pleasurably at the thought of what vast wings of spray and towers of solid water must crash up from here in a storm. He crossed the rocks at a trot, ran up a short grassy slope, raced through a fringe of trees, and came straight up against an 8-foot fence of heavy mesh topped with barbed wire and backed at a short distance with high, heavy shrubbery. Without pausing for surprise, in fact in his holiday mood using surprise as a goad, he jumped for the branch of an oak whose trunk touched the fence, scorning the easier lower branch on the other side of the tree. Then he drew himself up, worked his way to some higher branches that crossed the fence, and dropped down inside. Suddenly cautious, he gently parted the shrubbery, and before the first surprise could really sink in, had another. A closely mown lawn dotted with more shrubbery ran up to a snug white Cape Cod cottage. The single strand of a radio aerial stretched the length of the roof. Parked on a neat gravel driveway that crossed just in front of the cottage was a short, square-lined touring car that he recognised from remembered pictures as an ancient Essex. The whole scene had about it the same odd quietness as the cove. Then, with the air of a clockwork toy coming to life, the white door opened and an elderly woman came out, dressed in a long lace-edged dress and wide lacy hat. She climbed into the driver's seat of the Essex, sitting there very stiff and tall. The motor began to chug bravely, gravel skittered, and the car rolled off between the trees. The door of the house opened again, and a slim girl emerged. She wore a white silk dress that fell straight from square neckline to hip-height waistline, making the skirt seem very short. Her dark hair was bound with a white bandeau so that it curved close to her cheeks. A dark necklace dangled against the white of the dress. A newspaper was tucked under her arm. She crossed the driveway and tossed the paper down on a rattan table between 3 rattan chairs and stood watching a squirrel zigzag across the lawn. The man stepped through the wall of shrubbery, called, "Hello!" and walked toward her. She whirled around and stared at him as still as if her heart had stopped beating. Then she darted behind the table and waited for him there. Granting the surprise of his appearance, her alarm seemed not so much excessive as eerie, as if the man thought he were not an ordinary stranger, but a visitor from another planet. Approaching closer, he saw that she was trembling and that her breath was coming in rapid, irregular gasps. Yet the slim, sweet patrician face that stared into his had an underlying expression of expectancy that reminded him of the Cove. She couldn't have been more than 18. He stopped short of the table. Before he could speak, she stammered out, "Are you he?" "What do you mean?" he asked, smiling puzzledly. "The one who sends me the little boxes." "I was out sailing and I happened to land in the far cove. I didn't dream that anyone lived on this island, or even came here." "No one ever does come here," she replied. Her manner had changed, becoming at once more wary and less agitated, though still eerily curious. "It startled me tremendously to find this place," he blundered on, "especially the road and the car. Why, this island can't be more than 1/4 of a mile wide." "The road goes down to the wharf," she explained, "and up to the top of the island, where my aunts have a tree house." He tore his mind away from the picture of a woman dressed like Queen Mary clambering up a tree. "Was that your aunt I saw driving off?" "One of them. The other's taken the motorboat in for supplies." She looked at him doubtfully. "I'm not sure they'll like it if they find someone here." "There are just the 3 of you?" he cut in quickly, looking down the empty road that vanished among the oaks. She nodded. "I suppose you go into the mainland with your aunts quite often?" She shook her head. "It must get pretty dull for you." "Not very," she said, smiling. "My aunts bring me the papers and other things, even movies. We've got a projector. My favourite stars are Antonio Marino and Alice Terry. I like her even better than Clara Bow." He looked at her hard for a moment. "I suppose you read a lot?" She nodded. "Fitzgerald's my favourite author." She started around the table, hesitated, suddenly grew shy. "Would you like some lemonade?" He'd noticed the jewed silver pitcher, but only now realised his thirst. Yet when she handed him a glass, he held it untasted and said awkwardly, "I haven't introduced myself. I'm Jack Barr." She stared at his outstretched right hand, slowly extended her own toward it, shook it up and down exactly once, then quickly dropped it. He chuckled and gulped some lemonade. "I'm a biology student. Been working at Woods Hole the first part of the summer. But now I'm here to do some research in marine ecology, that sort of sea life patterns, of the inshore islands. Under the direction of Professor Kesserich. You know about him, of course." She shook her head. "Probably the greatest living biologist," he was proud to inform her. "Human physiology as well. Tremendous geneticist. In a class with Carlson and Jacques Loeb. Martin Kesserich. He lives over there at town. I'm staying with him. You ought to have heard of him," he grinned. "Matter of fact, I'd never have met you if it hadn't been for Mrs. Kesserich." The girl looked puzzled. Jack explained. "The old boy's been off to Europe on some conferences. Won't be back for a couple days more. But I was to get started anyhow. When I went out this morning, Mrs. Kesserich, she's a drab sort of person, said to me, 'Don't try to sail to the farther islands.' So of course I had to. By the way, you still haven't told me your name." "Mary Alice Pope," she said, speaking slowly and with an odd wonder, as if she were saying it for the first time. "You're pretty shy, aren't you?" "How would I know?" The question stopped Jack. He couldn't think of anything to say to this strangely attractive girl dressed almost like a flapper. "Will you sit down?" she asked him gravely. The rattan chair sighed under his weight. He made another effort to talk. "I'll bet you'll be glad when summer's over." "Why?" "So you'll be able to go back to the mainland." "But I never go to the mainland." "You mean you stay out here all winter?" he asked incredulously, his mind filled with a vision of snow and frozen spray and great grey waves. "Oh, yes. We get all our supplies on hand before winter. My aunts are very capable. They don't always wear long lace dresses. And now I help them." "But that's impossible," he said with sudden sympathetic anger. "You can't be shut off this way from people your own age." "You're the first one I ever met." She hesitated. "I never saw a boy or a man before, except in movies." "You're joking." "No, it's true." "But why are they doing it to you?" he demanded, leaning forward. "Why are they inflicting this loneliness on you, Mary?" She seemed to have gained poise from his loss of it. "I don't know why. I'm to find out soon. But actually I'm not lonely. May I tell you a secret?" She touched his hand, this time with only the faintest trembling. "Every night the loneliness gathers in around me. You're right about that. But then every morning new life comes to me in a little box." "What's that?" he said sharply. "Sometimes there's a poem in the box, sometimes a book, or pictures, or flowers, or a ring, but always a note. Next to the notes I like the poems best. My favourite is the one by Matthew Arnold that ends, 'Ah, love, let us be true to one another for the world which seems to lie before us like a land of dreams, so various, so beautiful, so new, hath really neither joy nor love nor light nor certitude.'" Wait a minute, he interrupted. Who sends you these boxes? I don't know. But how are the notes signed? They're wonderful notes, she said. So wise, so gay, so tender. You'd imagine them being written by John Barrymore or Lindbergh. Yes, but how are they signed? She hesitated. Never anything but your lover. And so when you first saw me, you thought... He began, then stopped because she was blushing. How long have you been getting them? Ever since I can remember. I have 2 closets of the boxes. The new ones are either by my bed when I wake or at my place at breakfast. But how does this person get these boxes to you out here? Does he give them to your aunt and do they put them there? I'm not sure. But how can they get them in winter? I don't know. Look here, he said, pouring himself more lemonade. How long is it since you've been to the mainland? Almost 18 years. My aunts tell me I was born there in the middle of the war. What war? He asked startledly, spilling some lemonade. The World War, of course. What's the matter? Jack Barr was staring down at the spilled lemonade and feeling a kind of terror he'd never experienced in his waking life. Nothing around him had changed. He could still feel the same hot sun on his shoulders, the same icy glass in his hand, scent the same lemon-acid odour in his nostrils. He could still hear the faint chop-chop of the waves. And yet everything had changed, gone dark and dizzy as a landscape glimpsed just before a faint. All the little false notes had come to a sudden focus. For the lemonade had spilled on the headline of the newspaper the girl had tossed down, and the headline read, Hitler and New Defiance. Under the big black banner of that head swam smaller ones. Foes of Machado riot in Havana. Big NRA parade planned. Balbo speaks in New York. Suddenly he felt a surge of relief. He had noticed that the paper was yellow and brittle-edged. Why are you so interested in old newspapers? He asked. I wouldn't call day before yesterday's paper old, the girl objected, pointing at the dateline, July 20th, 1933. You're trying to joke, Jack told her. No, I'm not. But it's 1953. Now it's you who are joking. But the paper's yellow. The paper's always yellow. He laughed uneasily. Well, if you actually think it's 1933, perhaps you're to be envied, he said, with a sardonic humour he didn't quite feel. Then you can't know anything about the Second World War, or television, or the V2s, or bikini bathing suits, or the atomic bomb, or... Stop! She had sprung up and retreated around her chair, white-faced. I don't like what you're saying. But, no, please, jokes that may be quite harmless on the mainland sound different here. I'm really not joking, he said after a moment. She grew quite frantic at that. I can show you all last week's papers. I can show you magazines and other things. I can prove it. She started toward the house. He followed. He felt his heart begin to pound. At the white door she paused, looking worriedly down the road. Jack thought he could hear the faint chug of a motorboat. She pushed open the door and he followed her inside. The small windowed room was dark after the sunlight. Jack got an impression of solid old furniture, a fireplace with brass andirons. Flash! Croaked a gritty voice. After their disastrous break day before yesterday, stocks are recovering. Leading issues. Jack realized that he had started and had involuntarily put his arm around the girl's shoulders. At the same time, he noticed that the voice was coming from the curved brown trumpet of an old-fashioned radio loudspeaker. The girl didn't pull away from him. He turned toward her. Although her grey eyes were on him, her attention had gone elsewhere. I can hear the car. They're coming back. They won't like it that you're here. All right, they won't like it. Her agitation grew. No, you must go. I'll come back tomorrow, he heard himself saying. Flash! It looks as if the World Economic Conference may soon adjourn, mouthing jeers at old Uncle Sam, who is generally referred to as Uncle Shylock. Jack felt a numbness on his neck. The room seemed to be darkening, the girl growing stranger still. You must go before they see you. Flash! Wiley Post has just completed his solo circuit of the globe, after a record-breaking flight of 7 days, 18 hours and 45 minutes. Asked how he felt after the energy-draining feat postscript. He was halfway across the lawn before he realized the terror into which the grating radio voice had thrown him. He leaped for the branch overhanging the fence, vaulted up with the risky help of a foot on the barbed top. A surprised squirrel, lacking time to make its escape up the trunk, sprang to the ground ahead of him. With terrible suddenness, 2 steel-jawed semicircles clanked together just over the squirrel's head. Jack landed with 1 foot to either side of the sprung trap, while the squirrel darted off with a squeak. Jack plunged down the slope to the rocky spine and ran across it, spray from the rising waves spattering him to the waist. Panting now, he stumbled up into the oaks and undergrowth of the first island, fought his way through it, finally reached the silent cove. He loosed the line of the Anio, dragged it as near to the cove's mouth as he could, plunged knee-deep in freezing water to give it a final shove, scrambled aboard, snatched up the boat hook, and punched at the rocks. As soon as the Annie O was nosing out of the cove into the crosswaves, he yanked up the sail. The freshening wind filled it and sent the sloop heeling over with inches of white water over the lee rail and plunging ahead. For a long while Jack was satisfied to think of nothing but the wind and the waves and the sail and speed and danger, to have all his attention taken up balancing one against the other so that he wouldn't have to ask himself what year it was and whether time was an illusion, and wonder about flappers and hidden traps. When he finally looked back at the island, he was amazed to see how tiny it had grown, as distant as the mainland. Then he saw a grey motorboat astern. He watched it as it slowly overtook him. It was built like a lifeboat, with a sturdy low cabin in the bow and wheel amidship. Whoever was at the wheel had long grey hair that whipped in the wind. The longer he looked, the surer he was that it was a woman wearing a lace dress. Something that stuck up inches over the cabin flashed darkly beside her. Only when she lifted it to the roof of the cabin did it occur to him that it might be a rifle. But just then the motorboat swung around in a turn that sent waves drenching over it and headed back toward the island. He watched it for a minute in wonder, then his attention was jolted by an angry hail. 3 fishing smacks, also headed toward town, were about to cross his bow. He came around into the wind and waited with shaking sail, watching a man in a lumpy sweater shake a fist at him. Then he turned and gratefully followed the dark wide fan-like sterns and age-yellowed sails. Part 2. The exterior of Martin Kesserik's home, a weathered white cube with narrow sharp-paned windows topped by a cupola, was nothing like its lavish interior. In much the same way Mrs. Kesserik clashed with the darkly gleaming furniture, Persian rugs and bronze vases around her. Her shapeless black form, poised awkwardly on the edge of a huge sofa, made Jack think of a cow that had strayed into the drawing-room. He wondered again how a man like Kesserik had come to marry such a creature. Yet when she lifted up her little eyes from the shadows, he had the uneasy feeling that she knew a great deal about him. The eyes were still those of a domestic animal, but of a wise one that has been watching the house a long, long while from the barnyard. He asked abruptly, "Do you know anything of a girl around here named Mary Alice Pope?" The silence lasted so long that he began to think she'd gone into some bovine trance. Then, without a word, she got up and went over to a tall cabinet. Feeling on a ledge behind it for a key, she opened a panel, opened a cardboard box inside it, took something from the box and handed him a photograph. He held it up to the failing light and sucked in his breath with surprise. It was a picture of the girl he'd met that afternoon. Same flat-bosomed dress, flowered rather than white, no bandeau, same beads, same proud, demure expression, perhaps a bit happier. "That is Mary Alice Pope," Mrs. Kesserik said in a strangely flat voice. "She was Martin's fiancée. She was killed in a railway accident in 1933. The small sound of the cabinet door closing brought Jack back to reality. He realized that he no longer had the photograph. Against the gloom by the cabinet, Mrs. Kesserik's white face looked at him with what seemed a malicious eagerness. "Sit down," she said, "and I'll tell you about it." Without a thought as to why she hadn't asked him a single question, he was much too dazed for that, he obeyed. Mrs. Kesserik resumed her position on the edge of the sofa. "You must understand, Mr. Barr, that Mary Alice Pope was the one love of Martin's life. He is a man of very deep and strong feelings, yet, as you probably know, anything but kindly or demonstrative. Even when he first came here from Hungary with his older sisters Hanny and Hilda, there was a cloak of loneliness about him, or rather about the 3 of them. Hanny and Hilda were athletic outdoor women, yet fiercely proud. I don't imagine they ever spoke to anyone in America except as to a servant, and with a seething distaste for all men except Martin. They showered all their devotion on him. So, of course, though Martin didn't realize it, they were consumed with jealousy when he fell in love with Mary Alice Pope. They thought that since he'd reached 40 without marrying, he was safe. Mary Alice came from a purebred, or as a biologist would say, inbred, British stock. She was very young, but very sweet, and up to a point very wise. She sensed Hanny and Hilda's feelings right away, and did everything she could to win them over. For instance, though she was afraid of horses, she took up horseback riding, because that was Hanny and Hilda's favourite pastime. Naturally, Martin knew nothing of her fear, and naturally his sisters knew about it from the first. But, and here is where Mary's wisdom fell short, her brave gesture did not pacify them, it only increased their hatred. Except for his research, Martin was blind to everything but his love. It was a beautiful and yet frightening passion, an insane cherishing as narrow and intense as his sister's hatred. With a start, Jack remembered that it was Mrs. Kesserik telling him all this. She went on. Martin's love directed his every move. He was building a home for himself and Mary, and in his mind he was building a wonderful future for them as well. Not vaguely, if you know Martin, but year by year, month by month. This winter, he'd planned, they would visit Buenos Aires. Next summer they would sail down the inland passage, and he would teach Mary Hungarian for their trip to Budapest the year after, where he would occupy a chair at the university for a few months. And so on. Finally, the time for their marriage drew near. Martin had been away. His research was keeping him very busy. Jack broke in with, "Wasn't that about the time he did his definitive work on growth and fertilization?" Mrs. Keserick nodded with solemn appreciation in the gathering darkness. But now he was coming home, his work done. It was early evening, very chilly, but Hanny and Hilda felt they had to ride down to the station to meet their brother. And although she dreaded it, Mary rode with them, for she knew how delighted he would be at her cantering to the puffing train and his running up to lift her down from the saddle to welcome him home. Of course, there was Martin's luggage to be considered, so the station wagon had to be sent down for that. She looked defiantly at Jack. "I drove the station wagon. I was Martin's laboratory assistant." She paused. It was almost dark, but there was still a white cold line of sky to the west. Annie and Hilda, with Mary between them, were waiting on their horses at the top of the hill that led down to the station. The train had whistled, and its headlight was greying the gravel of the crossing. Suddenly Mary's horse squealed and plunged down the hill. Annie and Hilda followed, to try to catch her, they said, but they didn't manage that, only kept her horse from veering off. Mary never screamed, but as her horse reared on the tracks, I saw her face in the headlight's glare. Martin must have guessed, or at least feared what had happened, for he was out of the train and running along the track before it stopped. In fact, he was the first to kneel down beside Mary, what had been Mary, and was holding her all bloody and shattered in his arms. A door slammed. There were steps in the hall. Mrs. Keserick stiffened and was silent. Jack turned. The blur of a face hung in the doorway to the hall, a seemingly young, sensitive, suavely handsome face with aristocratic jaw. Then there was a click and the lights flared up, and Jack saw the close-cropped grey hair and the lines around the eyes and nostrils, while the sensitive mouth grew sardonic. Yet the handsomeness stayed, and somehow the youth too, or at least a tremendous inner vibrancy. "Hello, Bar," Martin Keserick said, ignoring his wife. The great biologist had come home. Part 3. "Oh yes, and Jameson had a feeble paper on what he called individualization in marine worms. Bar, have you ever thought much about the larger aspects of the problem of individuality?" Jack jumped slightly. He had let his thoughts wander very far. "Not especially, sir," he mumbled. The house was still. A few minutes after the professor's arrival, Mrs. Keserick had gone off with an anxious glance at Jack. He knew why, and wished he could reassure her that he would not mention their conversation to the professor. Keserick had spent perhaps a half-hour briefing him on the more important papers delivered at the conferences. Then, almost as if it were a teacher's trick to show up a pupil's inattention, he had suddenly posed this question about individuality. "You know what I mean, of course," Keserick pressed. "The factors that make you, you, and me, me." "Heredity and environment," Jack parroted like a freshman. Keserick nodded. "Suppose, this is just speculation, that we could control heredity and environment. Then we could recreate the same individual at will." Jack felt a shiver go through him. To get exactly the same pattern of heredity traits? That'd be far beyond us. "What about identical twins?" Keserick pointed out. "And then there's parthenogenesis to be considered. One might produce a duplicate of the mother without the intervention of the male." Although his voice had grown more idly speculative, Keserick seemed to Jack to be smiling secretly. "There are many examples in the lower animal forms, to say nothing of the technique by which Loeb caused a sea urchin to reproduce with no more stimulus than a salt solution." Jack felt the hair rising on his neck. "Even then you wouldn't get exactly the same pattern of hereditary traits." "Not if the parents were of very pure stock? Not if there were some special technique for selecting ova that would reproduce all the mother's traits?" "But environment would change things," Jack objected. "The duplicate would be bound to develop differently." "Is environment so important? Newman tells about a pair of identical twins separated from birth, unaware of each other's existence. They met by accident when they were 21. Each was a telephone repairman. Each had a wife the same age. Each had a baby son, and each had a fox terrier called Trixie. That's without trying to make environments similar. But suppose you did try. Suppose you saw to it that each of them had exactly the same experiences at the same times." For a moment it seemed to Jack that the room was dimming and wavering, becoming a dark pool in which the only motionless thing was Keserick's sphinx-like face. "Well, we've escaped quite far enough from Jameson's marine worms," the biologist said, all brisk again. He said it as if Jack were the one who had led the conversation down wild and unprofitable channels. "Let's get on to your project. I want to talk it over now because I won't have any time for it tomorrow. Jack looked at him blankly. Tomorrow I must attend to a very important matter, the biologist explained. Part 4. Morning sunlight brightened the colours of the wax flowers under glass on the high bureau that always seemed to emit the faint odour of old hair combings. Jack pulled back the diamond-patterned quilt and blinked the sleep from his eyes. He expected his mind to be busy wondering about Keswick and his wife, things said and half-said last night, but found instead that his thoughts swung instantly to Mary Alice Pope, as if to a farthest island in a world of people. Downstairs the house was empty. After a long look at the cabinet, he felt behind it but the key was gone, he hurried down to the waterfront. He stopped only for a bowl of chowder and as an afterthought to buy 6 newspapers. The sea was bright, the brisk wind just right for the Annie-O. There was eagerness in the way it smacked the sail and in the creak of the mast, and when he reached the cove it was no longer still, but nervous with faint ripples as if time had finally begun to stir. After the same struggle with the underbrush he came out on the rocky spine and past the cove of the sea urchins. The spiny creatures struck an uncomfortable chord in his memory. This time he climbed the second island cautiously, scraping the innocent-seeming ground ahead of him intently with a boat hook he'd brought along for the purpose. He was only a few yards from the fence when he saw Mary Alice Pope standing behind it. He hadn't realised that his heart would begin to pound, or that, at the same time, a shiver of almost supernatural dread would go through him. The girl eyed him with an uneasy hostility, and immediately began to speak in a hushed, hurried voice. "You must go away at once, and never come back. You're a wicked man, but I don't want you to be hurt. I've been watching for you all morning." He tossed the newspapers over the fence. "You don't have to read them now," he told her. "Just look at the datelines and a few of the headlines." When she finally lifted her eyes to his again, she was trembling. She tried unsuccessfully to speak. "Listen to me," he said. "You've been the victim of a scheme to make you believe you were born around 1916 instead of 1933, and that it's 1933 now instead of 1951. I'm not sure why it's been done, though I think I know who you really are." "But," the girl faltered, "my aunts tell me it's 1933. "They would." "And there are the papers, the magazines, the radio." "The papers are old ones. The radio's faked, some sort of recording. I could show you if I could get at it." "These papers might be faked," she said, pointing to where she'd let them drop on the ground. "They're new," he said. "Only old papers get yellow." "But why would they do it to me? Why?" "Come with me to the mainland, Mary. That'll set you straight quicker than anything." "I couldn't," she said, drawing back. "He's coming tonight." "He?" "The man who sends me the boxes, and my life." Jack shivered. When he spoke, his voice was rough and quick. "A life that's completely a lie, that's cut you off from the world. Come with me, Mary." She looked up at him wonderingly. For perhaps 10 seconds the silence held and the spell of her eerie sweetness deepened. "I love you, Mary," Jack said softly. She took a step back. "Really, Mary, I do." She shook her head. "I don't know what's true. Go away." "Mary," he pleaded, "read the papers I've given you. Think things through. I'll wait for you here." "You can't. My aunts would find you." "Then I'll go away and come back, about sunset. Will you give me an answer?" She looked at him. Suddenly she whirled around. He too heard the chuff of the Essex. "They'll find us," she said. "And if they find you, I don't know what they'll do. Quick, run!" And she darted off herself, only to turn back to scramble for the papers. "But will you give me an answer?" he pressed. She looked frantically up from the papers. "I don't know. You mustn't risk coming back." "I will, no matter what you say." "I can't promise. Please go." "Just one question," he begged. "What are your aunts' names?" "Hanny and Hilda," she told him, and then she was gone. The hedge shook where she darted through. Jack hesitated, then started for the cove. He thought for a moment of staying on the island, but decided against it. He could probably conceal himself successfully, but whoever found his boat would have him at a disadvantage. Besides, there were things he must try to find out on the mainland. As he entered the Oaks, his spine tightened for a moment, as if someone were watching him. He hurried to the rippling cove, wasted no time getting the Annie-O underway. With the wind still in the west, he knew it would be a hard sail. He'd need 6 tacks to reach the mainland. When he was about 1/4 of a mile out from the cove, there was a sharp smack beside him. He jerked around, heard a distant crack, and saw a foot-long splinter of fresh wood dangling from the edge of the sloop's cockpit, about 1 foot from his head. He felt his skin tighten. He was the bullseye of a great watery target. All the air between him and the island was tainted with menace. Water splashed a yard from the side. There was another distant crack. He lay on his back in the cockpit, steering by the sail, taking advantage of what little cover there was. There were several more cracks. After the second, there was a hole in the sail. Finally, Jack looked back. The island was more than a mile astern. He anxiously scanned the sea ahead for craft. There were none. Then he settled down to nurse more speed from the sloop and wait for the motorboat. But it didn't come out to follow him. Part 5. Same as yesterday, Mrs. Keserick was sitting on the edge of the couch in the living room, yet from the first Jack was aware of a great change. Something had filled the domestic animal with grief and fury. "Where's Dr. Keserick?" he asked. "Not here." "Mrs. Keserick," he said, dropping down beside her. "You were telling me something yesterday when we were interrupted." She looked at him. "You have found the girl!" she almost shouted. "Yes," Jack was surprised into answering. A look of slyness came into Mrs. Keserick's bovine face. "Then I'll tell you everything. I can now. When Martin found Mary dying, he didn't go to pieces. You know how controlled he can be when he chooses. He lifted Mary's body as if the crowd and the railway men weren't there, and carried it to the station wagon. Hanny and Hilda were sitting on their horses nearby. He gave them one look. It was as if he had said, 'Murderers!' He told me to drive home as fast as I dared, but when I got there, he stayed sitting by Mary in the back. I knew he must have given up what hope he had for her life, or else she was dead already. I looked at him. In the dome light, his face had the most deadly and proud expression I've ever seen on a man. I worshipped him, you know, though he had never shown me 1 ounce of feeling, so I was completely unprepared for the naked appeal in his voice. Yet all he said at first was, 'Will you do something for me?' I told him, 'Surely,' and as we carried Mary in, he told me the rest. He wanted me to be the mother of Mary's child." Jack stared at her blankly. Mrs. Keserick nodded. "He wanted to remove an ovum from Mary's body and nurture it in mine, so that Mary, in a way, could live on." "But that's impossible," Jack objected. "The technique is being tried now on cattle, I know, so that a prize heifer can have several calves a year, all nurtured in scrub heifers, as they're called, but no one's ever dreamed of trying it on human beings." Mrs. Keserick looked at him contemptuously. "Martin had mastered the technique 20 years ago. He was willing to take the chance. And so was I, partly because he fired my scientific imagination and reverence, but mostly because he said he would marry me. He barred the doors. We worked swiftly. As far as anyone was concerned, Martin, in a wild fit of grief, had locked himself up for several hours to mourn over the body of his fiancée. Within a month we were married, and I finally gave birth to the child." Jack shook his head. "You gave birth to your own child?" She smiled bitterly. "No, it was Mary's. Martin did not keep his whole bargain with me. I was nothing more than his scrub wife in every way." "You think you gave birth to Mary's child." Mrs. Keserick turned on Jack in anger. "I've been wounded by him day in and day out for years, but I've never failed to recognize his genius. Besides, you've seen the girl, haven't you?" Jack had to nod. What confounded him most was that, granting the near-impossible physiological feat Mrs. Keserick had described, the girl should look so much like the mother. Mothers and daughters don't look that much alike, only identical twins did. With a thrill of fear, he remembered Keserick's casual words, "Parthenogenesis, pure stock, special techniques." "Very well," he forced himself to say. "Granting that the child was Mary's and Martin's—" "No, Mary's alone." Jack suppressed a shudder. He continued quickly. "What became of the child?" Mrs. Keserick lowered her head. "The day it was born, it was taken away from me. After that, I never saw Hilda and Hanny either." "You mean," Jack asked, "that Martin sent them away to bring up the child?" Mrs. Keserick turned away. "Yes," Jack asked incredulously. "He trusted the child with the 2 people he suspected of having caused the mother's death?" "Once, when I was his assistant," Mrs. Keserick said softly, "I carelessly broke some laboratory glassware. He kept me up all night building a new setup, though I'm rather poor at working with glass and usually get burned. Bringing up the child was his sister's punishment." "And they went to that house on the farthest island? I suppose it was the house he'd been building for Mary and himself." "Yes. And they were to bring up the child as his daughter?" Mrs. Keserick started up, but when she spoke it was as if she had to force out each word. "As his wife, as soon as she was grown." "How can you know that?" Jack asked shakily. The rising wind rattled the window pane. "Because today, 18 years after, Martin broke all of his promise to me. He told me he was leaving me." Part 6. White waves shooting up like dancing ghosts in the moon-sketched spray-swept dark were Jack's first beacon of the island, and brought a sense of physical danger, breaking the trance-like yet frantic mood he had felt ever since he had spoken with Mrs. Keserick. Coming around farther into the wind, he scudded past the end of the island into the choppy sea on the landward side. A little later, he let down the reefed sail in the cove of the sea urchins, where the water was barely moving, although the air was shaken by the pounding of the surf on the spine between the two islands. After making fast, he paused a moment for a scrap of cloud to pass the moon. The thought of the spiny creatures in the black fathoms under the Anio sent an odd quiver of terror through him. The moon came out and he started across the glistening rocks of the spine. But he had forgotten the rising tide. Midway, a wave clamped around his ankles, tried to carry him off, almost made him drop the heavy object he was carrying. Sprawling and drenched, he clung to the rough rock until the surge was past. Making it finally up to the fence, he snipped a wide gate with his wire cutters. The windows of the house were alight. Hardly aware of his shivering, he crossed the lawn, slipping from one clump of shrubbery to another, until he reached one just across the drive from the doorway. At that moment he heard the approaching chuff of the Essex. The door of the cottage opened, and Mary Alice Pope stepped out, closely followed by Hanny or Hilda. Jack shrank close to the shrubbery. Mary looked pale and blank-faced, as if she had retreated within herself. He was acutely conscious of the inadequacy of his screen as the ghostly headlights of the Essex began to probe through the leaves. But then he sensed that something more was about to happen than just the car arriving. It was a change in the expression of the face behind Mary that gave him the cue, a widening and sidewise flickering of the cold eyes, the puckered lips thinning into a cruel smile. The Essex shifted into second, and without any warning, accelerated. Simultaneously, the woman behind Mary gave her a violent shove, but at almost exactly the same instant, Jack ran. He caught Mary as she sprawled toward the gravel and lunged ahead without checking. The Essex bore down upon them, a square-snouted, roaring monster. It swerved viciously, missed them by inches, threw up gravel in a skid and rocked to a stop, stalled. The first incredulous voice that broke the pulsing silence Jack recognized as Martin Kesserik's. It came from the car, which was slewed around so that it almost faced Jack and Mary.
"Hannah, you tried to kill her! You and Hilda tried to kill her again!"
The woman slumped over the wheel, slowly lifted her head. In the indistinct light she looked the twin of the woman behind Jack and Mary.
"Did you really think we wouldn't?" she asked in a voice that spat with passion. "Did you actually believe that Hilda and I would serve this 18 years' penance just to watch you go off with her?" She began to laugh wildly. "You've never understood your sisters at all." Suddenly she broke off, stiffly stepped down from the car. Lifting her skirts a little, she strode past Jack and Mary. Martin Kesserik followed her. In passing he said, "Thanks, Pa." It occurred to Jack that Kesserik made no more question of his appearance on the island than of his presence in the laboratory. Like Mrs. Kesserik, the great biologist took him for granted. Kesserik stopped a few feet short of Hanny and Hilda. Without shrinking from him, the sisters drew closer together. They looked like two gaunt hawks. "But you waited 18 years, he said. "You could have killed her at any time, yet you chose to throw away so much of your lives just to have this moment."
"How do you know we didn't like waiting 18 years? Hanny answered him. "Why shouldn't we want to make as strong an impression on you as anyone? And as for throwing our lives away, that was your doing. Oh, Martin, you'll never know anything about how your sisters feel." He raised his hands baffledly.
"Even assuming that you hate me," at the word hate both Hanny and Hilda laughed softly, "and that you were prepared to strike at both my love and my work, still that you should have waited."
Hanny and Hilda said nothing. Kesserik shrugged.
"Very well," he said in a voice that had lost all its tension. "You've wasted a third of a lifetime looking forward to an irrational revenge. And you've failed. That should be sufficient punishment."
Very slowly he turned around and for the first time looked at Mary. His face was clearly revealed by the twin beams from the stalled car. Jack grew cold. He fought against accepting the feelings of wonder, of poignant triumph, of love, of renewed youth he saw entering the face in the headlights. But most of all he fought against the sense that Martin Kesserik was successfully drawing them all back into the past, to 1933 and another accident. There was a distant hoot and Jack shook. For a moment he had thought it a railway whistle and not a ship's horn. The biologist said tenderly, "Come, Mary." Jack's trembling arm tightened a trifle on Mary's waist. He could feel her trembling. "Come, Mary," Kesserik repeated. Still she didn't reply. Jack wet his lips. "Mary isn't going with you, Professor," he said.
"Quiet, Bar," Kesserik ordered absently. "Mary, it is necessary that you and I leave the island at once. Please, come."
"But Mary isn't coming," Jack repeated. Kesserik looked at him for the first time.
"I'm grateful to you for the unusual sense of loyalty, or whatever motive it may have been, that led you to follow me out here tonight. And of course I'm profoundly grateful to you for saving Mary's life. But I must ask you not to interfere further in a matter which you can't possibly understand." He turned to Mary. "I know how shocked and frightened you must feel. Living two lives and then having to face two deaths. It must be more terrible than anyone can realize. I expected this meeting to take place under very different circumstances. I wanted to explain everything to you very naturally and gently, like the messages I sent to you every day of your second life. Unfortunately, that can't be. You and I must leave the island right now."
Mary stared at him, then turned wonderingly toward Jack, who felt his heart begin to pound warmly. "You still don't understand what I'm trying to tell you, Professor," he said, boldly now. "Mary is not going with you. You've deceived her all her life. You've taken a fantastic amount of pains to bring her up under the delusion that she is Mary Alice Pope, who died in—"
"She is Mary Alice Pope!"
Keswick thundered at him. He advanced toward them swiftly.
"Mary, darling, you're confused, but you must realize who you are and who I am, and the relationship between us."
"Keep away," Jack warned, swinging Mary half behind him. "Mary doesn't love you. She can't marry you at any rate. How could she when you're her father?"
"Bah!"
"Keep off!" Jack shot out the flat of his hand and Keswick went staggering backward. "I've talked with your wife on the mainland. She told me the whole thing." Keswick seemed about to rush forward again, then controlled himself.
"You've got everything wrong. You hardly deserve to be told, but under the circumstances I have no choice. Mary is not my daughter. To be precise, she has no father at all. Do you remember the work that Jacques Lloyd did with sea urchins?"
Jack frowned angrily. "You mean what we were talking about last night?"
"Exactly. Loeb was able to cause the egg of a sea urchin to develop normally without union with a male germ cell. I have done the same tiding with a human being. This girl is Mary Alice Pope. She has exactly the same heredity. She has had exactly the same life, so far as it could be reconstructed. She's heard and read the same things at exactly the same times. There have been the old newspapers, the books, even the old recorded radio programs. Hanny and Hilda have had their daily instructions to the letter. She's retraced the same time trial."
"Rot," Jack interrupted. "I don't for a moment believe what you say about her birth. She's Mary's daughter, or the daughter of your wife on the mainland. And as for retracing the same time trial, that's senile self-delusion. Mary Alice Pope had a normal life. This girl has been brought up in cruel imprisonment by two insane, vindictive old women. In your own frustrated desire, you've pretended to yourself that you've recreated the girl you lost. You haven't. You couldn't. Nobody could. The great Martin Keswick or anyone else." Keswick, his features working, shifted his point of attack.
"Who are you, Mary?"
"Don't answer him," Jack said. "He's trying to confuse you."
"Who are you?"
Keswick insisted. "Mary Alice Pope," she said rapidly in a breathy whisper before Jack could speak again.
"And when were you born?"
Keswick pressed on. "You've been tricked all your life about that," Jack warned. But already the girl was saying, "In 1916.
"And who am I, then?" Keswick demanded eagerly. "Who am I?"
The girl swayed. She brushed her head with her hand. "It's so strange," she said with a dreamy, almost laughing throb in her voice that turned Jack's heart cold. "I'm sure I've never seen you before in my life, and yet it's as if I'd known you forever. As if you were closer to me than—" "Stop it!" Jack shouted at Keswick. "Mary loves me. She loves me because I've shown her the lie her life has been, and because she's coming away with me now. Aren't you, Mary?" He swung her around so that her blank face was inches from his own. "It's me you love, isn't it, Mary?" She blinked doubtfully. At that moment, Keswick charged at them, went sprawling as Jack's fist shot out. Jack swept up Mary and ran with her across the lawn. Behind him he heard an agonized cry, Keswick's, and cruel mounting laughter from Hanny and Hilda. Once through the ragged doorway in the fence, he made his way more slowly, gasping. Out of the shelter of the trees the wind tore at them and the ocean roared. Moonlight glistened, now on the spine of black wet rocks, now on the foaming surf. Jack realized that the girl in his arms was speaking rapidly, disjointedly, but he couldn't quite make out the sense of the words, and then they were lost in the crash of the surf. She struggled, but he told himself that it was only because she was afraid of the menacing waters. He pushed recklessly into the breaking surf, raced gasping across the middle of the spine as the rocks uncovered, sprang to the higher ones as the next wave crashed behind, showering them with spray. His chest burning with exertion, he carried the girl the few remaining yards to where the Annie O was tossing. A sudden great gust of wind almost did what the waves had failed to do, but he kept his footing and lowered the girl into the boat, then jumped in after. She stared at him wildly. "What's that?" He too had caught the faint shout. Looking back along the spine just as the moon came clear again, he saw white spray rise and fall, and then the figure of Keswick stumbling through it.
"Mary, wait for me!"
The figure was halfway across when it lurched, started forward again, then was jerked back as if something had caught its ankle. Out of the darkness, the next wave sent a line of white at it, neck high, crashed. Jack hesitated, but another great gust of wind tore at the half-raised sail, and it was all he could do to keep the sloop from capsizing and head her into the wind again. Mary was tugging at his shoulder. "You must help him," she was saying.
He's caught in the rocks! He heard a voice crying, screaming crazily above the surf. Ah, love, let us be true, to one another, for the world. The sloop rocked. Jack had it finally headed into the wind. He looked around for Mary. She had jumped out and was hurrying back, scrambling across the rocks toward the dark, struggling figure that even as he watched was once more engulfed in the surf. Letting go the lines, Jack sprang toward the stern of the sloop. But just then another giant blow came, struck the sail like a great fist of air and sent the boom slashing at the back of his head. His last recollection was being toppled out onto the rocks and wondering how he could cling to them while unconscious. Part 7. The little cove was once again as quiet as Time's heart. Once again the Annie O was a sloop embedded in a mirror. Once again the rocks were warm underfoot. Jack Barr lifted his fiercely aching head and looked at the distant line of the mainland, as tiny and yet as clear as something viewed through the wrong end of a telescope. He was very tired. Searching the island in his present shaky condition had taken all the strength out of him. He looked at the peacefully rippling sea outside the cove and thought of what a churning pot it had been during the storm. He thought wonderingly of his rescue, a man wedged unconscious between two rock teeth, kept somehow from being washed away by the merest chance. He thought of Mrs. Keserick sitting alone in her house, scanning the newspapers that had nothing to tell. He thought of the empty island behind him and the vanished motorboat. He wondered if the sea had pulled down Martin Keserick and Mary Alice Pope. He wondered if only Hanny and Hilda had sailed away. He winced, remembering what he had done to Martin and Mary by his blundering infatuation. In his way, he told himself, he had been as bad as the two old women. He thought of death, and of time, and of love that defies them. He stepped limpingly into the Annie O to set sail, and realized that philosophy is only for the unhappy. Mary was asleep in the stern.
Beyond Lies the Wub by Philip K. Dick. Narrated by William Skye. The slovenly wub might well have said, "Many men talk like philosophers and live like fools." They had almost finished with the loading. Outside stood the Optus, his arms folded, his face sunk in gloom. Captain Franco walked leisurely down the gangplank, grinning. "What's the matter?" he said. "You getting paid for all this?" The Optus said nothing. He turned away, collecting his robes. The captain put his boot on the hem of the robe. "Just a minute, don't go off. I'm not finished." "Oh?" The Optus turned with dignity. "I'm going back to the village." He looked toward the animals and birds being driven up the gangplank into the spaceship. "I must organize new hunts." Franco lit a cigarette. "Why not? You people can go out into the veldt and track it all down again. But when we run out halfway between Mars and Earth..." The Optus went off wordless. Franco joined the first mate at the bottom of the gangplank. "How's it coming?" he said. He looked at his watch. "We got a good bargain here." The mate glanced at him sourly. "How do you explain that?" "What's the matter with you? We need it more than they do." "I'll see you later, Captain." The mate threaded his way up the plank between the long-legged Martian go-birds into the ship. Franco watched him disappear. He was just starting up after him, up the plank toward the port, when he saw it. "My God!" He stood staring, his hands on his hips. Peterson was walking along the path, his face red, leading it by a string. "I'm sorry, Captain," he said, tugging at the string. Franco walked toward him. "What is it?" The wub stood sagging, its great body settling slowly. It was sitting down, its eyes half shut. A few flies buzzed about its flank and it switched its tail. It sat. There was silence. "It's a wub," Peterson said. "I got it from a native for 50 cents. He said it was a very unusual animal, very respected." "This?" Franco poked the great sloping side of the wub. "It's a pig! A huge dirty pig!" "Yes, sir, it's a pig. The natives call it a wub." "A huge pig! It must weigh 400 pounds. Franco grabbed a tuft of the rough hair. The wub gasped. Its eyes opened, small and moist. Then its great mouth twitched. A tear rolled down the wub's cheek and splashed on the floor. "Maybe it's good to eat," Peterson said nervously. "We'll soon find out," Franco said. The wub survived the takeoff, sound asleep in the hold of the ship. When they were out in space and everything was running smoothly, Captain Franco bade his men fetch the wub upstairs so that he might perceive what manner of beast it was. The wub grunted and wheezed, squeezing up the passageway. "Come on," Jones grated, pulling at the rope. The wub twisted, rubbing its skin off on the smooth chrome walls. It burst into the anteroom, tumbling down in a heap. The men leaped up. "Good Lord," French said. "What is it?" "Peterson says it's a wub," Jones said. "It belongs to him." He kicked at the wub. The wub stood up unsteadily, panting. "What's the matter with it?" French came over. "Is it going to be sick?" They watched. The wub rolled its eyes mournfully. It gazed around at the men. "I think it's thirsty," Peterson said. He went to get some water. French shook his head. "No wonder we had so much trouble taking off. I had to reset all my ballast calculations." Peterson came back with the water. The wub began to lap gratefully, splashing the men. Captain Franco appeared at the door. "Let's have a look at it." He advanced, squinting critically. "You got this for 50 cents?" "Yes, sir," Peterson said. "It eats almost anything. I fed it on grain and it liked that, and then potatoes and mash and scraps from the table and milk. It seems to enjoy eating. After it eats, it lies down and goes to sleep." "I see," Captain Franco said. "Now, as to its taste, that's the real question. I doubt if there's much point in fattening it up anymore. It seems fat enough to me already. Where's the cook? I want him here. I want to find out—" The wub stopped lapping and looked up at the captain. "Really, Captain," the wub said, "I suggest we talk of other matters." The room was silent. "What was that?" Franco said. "Just now?" "The wub, sir," Peterson said. "It spoke." They all looked at the wub. "What did it say? What did it say?" "It suggested we talk about other things." Franco walked toward the wub. He went all around it, examining it from every side. Then he came back over and stood with the men. "I wonder if there's a native inside it," he said thoughtfully. "Maybe we should open it up and have a look." "Oh, goodness," the wub cried. "Is that all you people can think of, killing and cutting?" Franco clenched his fists. "Come out of there! Whoever you are, come out!" Nothing stirred. The men stood together, their faces blank, staring at the wub. The wub swished its tail. It belched suddenly. "I beg your pardon," the wub said. "I don't think there's anyone in there," Jones said in a low voice. They all looked at each other. The cook came in. "You wanted me, Captain?" he said. "What's this thing?" "This is a wub," Franco said. "It's to be eaten. Will you measure it and figure out—" "I think we should have a talk," the wub said. "I'd like to discuss this with you, Captain, if I might. I can see that you and I do not agree on some basic issues." The captain took a long time to answer. The wub waited good-naturedly, licking the water from its jowls. "Come into my office," the captain said at last. He turned and walked out of the room. The wub rose and padded after him. The men watched it go out. They heard it climbing the stairs. "I wonder what the outcome will be," the cook said. "Well, I'll be in the kitchen. Let me know as soon as you hear." "Sure," Jones said. "Sure." The wub eased itself down in the corner with a sigh. "You must forgive me," it said. "I'm afraid I'm addicted to various forms of relaxation. When one is as large as I—" The captain nodded impatiently. He sat down at his desk and folded his hands. "All right," he said. "Let's get started. You're a wub, is that correct?" The wub shrugged. "I suppose so. That's what they call us, the natives, I mean. We have our own term." "And you speak English? You've been in contact with Earthmen before?" "No." "Then how do you do it?" "Speak English? Am I speaking English? I'm not conscious of speaking anything in particular. I examined your mind." "My mind?" "I studied the contents, especially the semantic warehouse, as I refer to it." "I see," the captain said. "Telepathy, of course." "We are a very old race," the wub said. "Very old and very ponderous. It is difficult for us to move around. You can appreciate that anything so slow and heavy would be at the mercy of more agile forms of life. There was no use in our relying on physical defenses. How could we win? Too heavy to run, too soft to fight, too good-natured to hunt for game. How do you live?" "Plants, vegetables. We can eat almost anything. We're very Catholic. Tolerant, eclectic, Catholic. We live and let live. That's how we've gotten along." The wub eyed the captain. "And that's why I so violently objected to this business about having me boiled. I could see the image in your mind. Most of me in the frozen food locker, some of me in the kettle, a bit for your pet cat." "So you read minds," the captain said. "How interesting. Anything else? I mean, what else can you do along those lines?" "A few odds and ends," the wub said absently, staring around the room. "A nice apartment you have here, Captain. You keep it quite neat. I respect life forms that are tidy. Some Martian birds are quite tidy. They throw things out of their nests and sweep them." "Indeed," the captain nodded. "But to get back to the problem." "Quite so. You spoke of dining on me. The taste, I am told, is good. A little fatty, but tender. But how can any lasting contact be established between your people and mine if you resort to such barbaric attitudes? Eat me? Rather you should discuss questions with me, philosophy, the arts." The captain stood up. "Philosophy? It might interest you to know that we will be hard put to find something to eat for the next month. An unfortunate spoilage." "I know," the wub nodded, "but wouldn't it be more in accord with your principles of democracy if we all drew straws or something along that line? After all, democracy is to protect the minority from just such infringements. Now, if each of us casts one vote—" The captain walked to the door. "Nuts to you," he said. He opened the door. He opened his mouth. He stood frozen, his mouth wide, his eyes staring, his fingers still on the knob. The wub watched him. Presently it padded out of the room, edging past the captain. It went down the hall, deep in meditation. The room was quiet. "So you see," the wub said, "we have a common myth. Your mind contains many familiar myth symbols. Ishtar, Odysseus." Peterson sat silently staring at the floor. He shifted in his chair. "Go on," he said. "Please go on." "I find in your Odysseus a figure common to the mythology of most self-conscious races. As I interpret it, Odysseus wanders as an individual, aware of himself as such. This is the idea of separation from family and country, the process of individuation." "But Odysseus returns to his home." Peterson looked out the port window at the stars, endless stars burning intently in the empty universe. "Finally he goes home." "As must all creatures. The moment of separation is a temporary period, a brief journey of the soul. It begins, it ends. The wanderer returns to land and race." The door opened. The wub stopped, turning its great head. Captain Franco came into the room, the men behind him. They hesitated at the door. "Are you all right?" French said. "Do you mean me?" Peterson said, surprised. "Why me?" Franco lowered his gun. "Come over here," he said to Peterson. "Get up and come here." There was silence. "Go ahead," the wub said. "It doesn't matter." Peterson stood up. "What for?" "It's an order." Peterson walked to the door. French caught his arm. "What's going on?" Peterson wrenched loose. "What's the matter with you?" Captain Franco moved toward the wub. The wub looked up from where it lay in the corner, pressed against the wall. "It is interesting," the wub said, "that you are obsessed with the idea of eating me. I wonder why." "Get up," Franco said. "If you wish." The wub rose, grunting. "Be patient. It is difficult for me." It stood, gasping, its tongue lolling foolishly. "Shoot it now," French said. "For God's sake!" Peterson exclaimed. Jones turned to him quickly, his eyes grey with fear. "You didn't see him. Like a statue standing there, his mouth open. If we hadn't come down, he'd still be there." "Who? The captain?" Peterson stared around. "But he's all right now." They looked at the wub standing in the middle of the room, its great chest rising and falling. "Come on," Franco said. "Out of the way." The men pulled aside toward the door. "You are quite afraid, aren't you?" the wub said. "Have I done anything to you? I am against the idea of hurting. All I have done is try to protect myself. Can you expect me to rush eagerly to my death? I am a sensible being like yourselves. I was curious to see your ship, learn about you. I suggested to the native—" The gun jerked. "See?" Franco said. "I thought so." The wub settled down, panting. It put its paw out, pulling its tail around it. "It is very warm," the wub said. "I understand that we are close to the jets. Atomic power. You have done many wonderful things with it, technically. Apparently your scientific hierarchy is not equipped to solve moral, ethical... Franco turned to the men crowding behind him, wide-eyed, silent. I'll do it. You can watch. French nodded. Try to hit the brain. It's no good for eating. Don't hit the chest. If the ribcage shatters, we'll have to pick bones out. Listen, Peterson said, licking his lips. Has it done anything? What harm has it done? I'm asking you. And anyhow, it's still mine. You have no right to shoot it. It doesn't belong to you. Franco raised his gun. I'm going out, Jones said, his face white and sick. I don't want to see it. Me too, French said. The men straggled out, murmuring. Peterson lingered at the door. It was talking to me about myths, he said. It wouldn't hurt anyone. He went outside. Franco walked toward the wub. The wub looked up slowly. It swallowed. A very foolish thing, it said. I am sorry that you want to do it. There was a parable that your saviour related. It stopped, staring at the gun. Can you look me in the eye and do it? The wub said. Can you do that? The captain gazed down. I can look you in the eye, he said. Back on the farm we had hogs, dirty razorback hogs. I can do it. Staring down at the wub, into the gleaming, moist eyes, he pressed the trigger. The taste was excellent. They sat glumly around the table, some of them hardly eating at all. The only one who seemed to be enjoying himself was Captain Franco. More? He said, looking around. More? And some wine, perhaps? Not me, French said. I think I'll go back to the chart room. Me too, Jones stood up, pushing his chair back. I'll see you later. The captain watched them go. Some of the others excused themselves. What do you suppose the matter is? The captain said. He turned to Peterson. Peterson sat staring down at his plate, at the potatoes, the green peas, and at the thick slab of tender, warm meat. He opened his mouth. No sound came. The captain put his hand on Peterson's shoulder. It is only organic matter now, he said. The life essence is gone. He ate, spooning up the gravy with some bread. I, myself, love to eat. It is one of the greatest things that a living creature can enjoy. Eating, resting, meditation, discussing things. Peterson nodded. 2 more men got up and went out. The captain drank some water and sighed. Well, he said, I must say that this was a very enjoyable meal. All the reports I had heard were quite true, the taste of wub. Very fine. But I was prevented from enjoying this pleasure in times past. He dabbed at his lips with his napkin and leaned back in his chair. Peterson stared dejectedly at the table. The captain watched him intently. He leaned over. Come, come, he said. Cheer up. Let's discuss things. He smiled. As I was saying before I was interrupted, the role of Odysseus in the myths... Peterson jerked up, staring. To go on, the captain said, Odysseus, as I understand him...
If you're enjoying the stories, hit the like button to support the channel and subscribe for more. Thanks. Psychotennis, anyone? By Lloyd Williams. Narrated by William Skye. If scientific advance changes our forms of courtship, can other sports be far behind? Not when telekinesis is finally perfected. Before them, the ball took a savage turn toward the player in white. Around Grant, the crowd stood up and roared, and he felt suddenly tense and doubting. Then the player ducked, the ball shot through above him to smash against the court wall, and he controlled the rebound to send the sphere once more into erratic, darting flight. Again! Grant felt his muscles suddenly relax with release of anxiety. He turned to the girl. "B, I'm worried. It's not like Tony. Does he want to get killed? He should stop those shots, not dodge them. Are you sure he's all right?" "Now, Granny," the girl kept her eyes fixed on the court. "Remember, Tony took this match for charity. He wants the crowd to have a show, that's all. He's in splendid shape." "No sleep," Grant went on worriedly. "I'm sure it must be that. If his brain were alert, he'd control that ball until Slag went crazy. Without sleep, you can't focus Please, Granny, stop!" In that instant, her throbbing mind touched his, and he caught a glimpse of the alarm in her face. She too felt that something was wrong, but she tugged at his sleeve and pointed through the screen at the oval below. "Look!" Slag's feet were set wide apart, and his black-robed body stood square. but his head had begun a sort of slow wobble from side to side as the ball lanced in perihedral swings about the court. "Praise Allah," whispered Grant. "A beautiful dance. Tony's thinking that gangster into a coma." The white player was in concentration, using his eyes only rarely and shifting ever more complex movements to the sphere. Then the rhythmic pattern had become a wild corondo, with Slag as its centre, and the dark figure stood hypnotized, with only spasmodic jerks of his brutal features to mark the fear in his mind. "Now," said Grant. His voice seemed loud in the awed silence of spectators. "Now, Tony! Call it a day!" "Just touch him," whispered B. "Don't hurt him, Tony." It was as if they had signalled the player even through the teleproof screen. Gradually the wild swings of the ball slowed. It circled Slag gently, dropped closer, and poised above him. Tony's mind was clearly in full control of the sensitive sphere. In a seat behind Grant, an excited man suddenly yelled, "Thumbs down, hard!" Obviously the crowd was ready to sacrifice its erstwhile hero. Then the ball moved, a small movement, and there was a roar. Uninfluenced, the ball dropped and rolled to the centre court, and Tony stood in bewilderment as Slag shook himself awake. Grant leaped up and tried to push through to the box exit. Behind him B clung. "Granny, what will you do? What can you—" He shook her off and answered her with his mind as he struggled on. "Stop them, that's what! End the match!" "How? You know you cannot!" But he felt her mind cling at the hope and sent back reassurance. "I can. They may not like it, but I can stop these matches. Don't worry, I'll get your brother safely out of there." She was relieved. Knowledge of his position, his relation to the sport. He felt her memory produce the reasons. "Sport," thought Grant. "I invented a sport. Oh Allah, what has my sport become?" And then her mind shrieked at him, stabbed at his brain. "Tony! Tony, darling!" Dazedly he heard the moan and fought a path to the transparent screen. Out on the court lay a white figure, outspread, and the ball rolled slowly past the dripping head. "Too late!" sobbed B. "Too late! Tony!" Somehow she was down there before Grant. He saw her huddled over Tony's body as he finally reached an open gate in the domed screen. On the opposite edge of the court, Psychosport Commissioner Woods was in conversation with the referee Harmon. A flashbulb glowed. 3 reporters looked at the fallen player and spoke casually to each other. Towering above the group was Slag, staring down as if surprised. Grant went first to the commissioner, who adopted a defensive attitude immediately, throwing up his hands. "Don't jump on me now! It seems I am helpless. Ask Harmon yourself. There was nothing wrong that he could see." "That's nonsense," said Grant, "and you know it. No matter who it is, a ball will not smash into an awake player. It simply cannot be done. Even a novice can over-control his opponent at that range." "Right. It couldn't have happened." Sarcasm indicated the worry felt by Woods. "Damn it, Lane, that's the way it is. Harmon watched like a hawk in his bubble. The dome was sealed, not a single leak. Slag's second crouched behind the shield and never moved. I personally supervised Anthony's examination. He was in perfect condition. The only thing yet to check is the ball. But the ball... You have it? Never mind, no ball invented could do that alone. Tony could handle any ball, even without the new sensitive core. And in 100 games every day, they don't ever have this sort of accident." "Just when Slag plays..." The commissioner touched Grant's arm helplessly. "The force of the man's mind must be terrible, Lane. He must be a superman. But what am I going to do? If I outlaw him without legal grounds..." He stopped, gulped nervously. "There may be no grounds from your point of view and theirs," Grant gestured at the crowd struggling through the exits. "But there are from mine. If I'm to remain honorary president of the association, Slag has got to go. That's final." Wood said, "Lane, you could stop this another way. If you don't, and you put Slag out, they will think..." But Grant was already hurrying over to B. Anthony. More people joined the group, and talk died away as uniformed men bent down to the prone figure. B sobbed in Grant's arms. Her mind was withdrawn, grieving, and he patted her awkwardly while he thought of how much these young twins had come to mean to him in the years since he began his research in metaphysics. Just children they had seemed at first. He had been young, Dr. Lane, graduate of 52 on fellowship, and they were the kids he had worked with, who had shown remarkable powers of the mind. Tony and himself, they had formulated the methods which still governed the cultivation of telekinesis. Grant had discovered the principles, but it was the successful results of the Anthony boys' training which paved the way for others to learn. Yet B was different. No amount of tutoring could help her influence an object with her mind. Different, but not inferior, for B was a telepath. With intimates, her conversation was most strange, much of it understood yet left unspoken. Grant was one of the intimates. Her silent sorrow would have found him at any distance, but now he tried to evade it because Tony was gone, and Woods had come over to face the reporters and Slag. "Mr. Woods," began one of the men, but the commissioner raised a hand and turned to the giant player. "You have had my personal warning, Slag. Do you think I will allow you to carry on your ugly career? Why, man, you're lucky the courts have not ruled you a murderer." "It's not my fault," Slag said. "I didn't try to smash him, honest. I don't know my own strength, I guess." Bee's reddened eyes stared at the man, and Grant whispered, "Darling, can you tell? You know their minds are closed to me. I just feel something evil. I must get out of here. Please, Grant, take me away." Behind Slag, the little blonde man Teagle, manager and second of the professionals, spoke up. "Like Slag says, Commissioner, it isn't his fault. These fast-thinking players match him, get all excited in the court, and then wonder why they get knocked down. They just don't have the stuff to match a champ." "Slag is the only man ever won to pull his shots," agreed a reporter who was taking notes. "Gentlemen," Woods turned to Grant, "all of us here respect the opinion of Dr. Lane, who brought this sport into being, and who is, in my estimation, its greatest exponent. I have consulted with him. If he is to retain any connection whatever with the game, he informs me, Slag must get out." There was silence. The men stared first at the florid-faced commissioner, then at Grant. "More than personal considerations are involved," added Woods. "Slag's brutal style of play, according to Dr. Lane, endangers the entire future of this grand sport." The black-robed player looked around for support. Little Teagle pushed in front of the commissioner. "You mean that has-been," he pointed at Grant, "is trying to get rid of my boy? It ain't fair, I say. Even when he tries to take it easy, Slag has it tough. They're scared and won't match us, even these amateurs. And yet look at what we've done to pep the game up." "You might be right, Mr. Teagle. All things considered, however, I feel the merit of Dr. Lane suggests—" "Who is this Lane?" The little man's face was fierce. "So he starts the game and invents the ball, so what? They used to call him a champ, the master, but that's a long time ago. Now that he's out, he don't like Slag coming up so strong. It kills him that he ain't the best anymore." "That will be all for tonight. In the morning I'll have an official release ready." The reporters were tense, anxious to miss nothing. "And gentlemen, you have a good idea of the nature of that statement." "Wait, I'm telling you," said Teagle. "We've tried to get a match with this Lane. Here it is, boys, the real truth. The guy wants Slag out because he's scared to meet him. Right here and now we challenge him, and I bet he hasn't got the guts to take us up." "I feel," said Woods, "that a scientist like Dr. Lane should not be subjected to this insolence." The reporters ran toward the exit, eager to call in this news break. Grant said nothing. Aware of Bee's feelings, he shot a look of contempt at Teagle and turned. Yet he knew, as they walked slowly away, that behind him were no feelings of goodwill. At best, the men awaited his next move, and until then suspended judgment. In 3 days, the city became for Grant Lane a savage jungle. The papers shrieked at him Teagle's endless insults, Slag's boastful challenge. Each statement by the commissioner cleverly shifted more responsibility from Woods to himself, and the tragic end of yet another match was played down, until it appeared that Slag, and not his opponent, was the injured party. After all, was his crowd convincing argument, did they jail professional fighters in the old days when one was killed? Just a little accident in the heat of fair contest, it was no more than that. Yet there was more this time. People appeared unsatisfied, disapproving of Grant, as if he should offer himself as a sacrifice to their sympathy with Slag. The one time he went restlessly into the streets, they watched him sullenly, waiting. He kept to his apartment after that and studied furiously. No man could over-control an awake opponent in a direct shot, if the ball was all right. As the ball closed in, the approached player's influence grew proportionately stronger, while his opponent's lessened in inverse ratio. That was the reason Grant had originally declared the sport to be safe. He interrupted his work only briefly for Tony's funeral, and felt an obscure shame in facing B. Anthony. Then the cellular organism of the sphere used in the game absorbed his attention again. It was an artificially nurtured nerve centre, a growth devised by himself, and seemed to offer the only possible answer. Perhaps this sublife had acquired learning ability, the ability to act independently. It seemed absurd, and yet how much was really known of this highly irritable stuff called living matter? B found him at his apartment the 4th morning. She seemed much more relaxed. "Tony hated useless grief," she said. "I had to come here, Granny. I had to know that we might see the end of all this." "Yes." Grant still felt a vague shame. We'll have to stop Slag short before he adds any more victims.
Oh, it's more than that. It's the people, too, and the knowledge that more Slags may appear. If all the matches suddenly... She broke off, frowning as if uncertain whether to continue. You see, Granny, Tony decided to play because of that. It wasn't even the charities, really. The people distrust you. Not just because you were wrong, but because they are suspicious of any probing into the powers of mind. They prefer fantasy to scientific hypothesis, and now Slag's triumphs. She faltered and unhappily twisted her face away. But Tony could have crushed Slag, too. You know that was different. He had Slag hypnotized first, but Tony was awake when the ball struck. You're right, B. Frankly, I don't know what the answer could be. I'm working on the core of the ball. There is a chance. I'm sure it was something else. Granny, have you thought of the screen? There must have been a leak or a failure. Think of that crowd hoping for their hero. Suppose they subconsciously influenced the sphere, directed it at Tony. He thought of the mob's reaction when Slag was helpless and kept silent. It would be cruel to blast her one hope with nothing to offer in exchange. You think I'm wrong, but what else would it be? The ball couldn't kill Tony by itself. Then she was in tears. I should have been there to stop it. He wouldn't take a second. I begged him to let me, and I would have sensed any outside influence. Grant recognized the guilt feeling she was suffering from. He tried to give comfort, but suddenly she was a woman, proud and independent, and would not stay. Only at the door for one moment did she turn appealingly to him. Granny, you're not going to play Slag. Do you want me to? Should I obey the roar of the mob? And look, he gestured at one of the papers where a centre-page box proclaimed, Commissioner rules out Lane Slag match. At 37 they say I'm too old to play. Don't do it, Grant. He felt her conflicting, torn emotions. Yet the funny thing is, I don't think I could live if they allow Slag to go on and on. Grant's apartment was ill-equipped for working with microorganisms, so although preliminary study opened up no encouraging line of experimentation, next day he transferred his work to the university laboratories. He found his colleagues friendly. One had cheerfully handled Grant's lectures during his absence, but reserved, as if they suspected him to be guilty of some terrible sin, yet he hoped he might prove himself innocent. Barker, the biochemist, listened to his theory of the probability of change in the nerve centre of the ball. I have not worked with these cultures, he said. You claim they are artificially produced solely to provide a focal receptor for the controlling minds. Are the cells non-reproductive? Yes. You see, the structure must be stable. Any mind can provide the necessary power to move light objects short distances, but focusing that power is the difficulty, hence the sensitive core. The operator can sense where to direct his will. Barker reflected a moment. So the culture is purely static, doesn't even amplify the influence. In that case, I can only visualize such changes as natural radiation might bring about. No hope there for a recurrent pattern of change. Learning ability, acquisition of power to act voluntarily. I thought the answer might be in that. We'll see. Might as well begin there, anyway. Get at a few of the balls, Lane, and I'm sure the staff will gladly try to help out. That evening, Grant walked onto the court of the Colosseum and was made certain of the city's anger toward him. B's idea was worth testing, and he had brought with him some student telepaths, but the instant he appeared, the crowd rose in a storm of fury. When the announcer requested spectators to direct the ball at Grant, their wrath gave way to cheers, and they concentrated hopefully on crushing him. But the screen held. The telepath sensed no invading influence as Grant whirled the ball about the court, until in disgust he signalled for the screen to be deactivated. Instantly the will of the crowd took hold. The sphere jerked erratically until concerted influence steadied it opposite Grant. Then it flashed into motion, a heavy, deadly missile, with all the mind power of a mob driving it murderously across the court at him. He stopped it easily, 6 inches away. Barker said, No use seeking further. We may not know everything living organisms can do, but we can certainly tell what is beyond their power. The tests are conclusive. Lorms, the behaviourist, nodded his head. For just an instant Grant felt confused, helpless. His original arguments for psychosport were proved valid, but the killings became even more inexplicable. They were logically impossible, and somehow that made him the criminal. That left him only one thing to do. It was humiliating to accept such a solution to his personal problem. He thought of B. Anthony and nearly turned back. Only since the tragedy had he realized how changed was their relationship, and how important she was to him. Would she scorn his action, think him a slave to public pressure? Probably, but Grant forced his steps onward. In the lobby of the Page Horton, B caught him by the arm. Since when?
she asked. "Do you walk grimly past your friends?" "No, Grant. Don't bother to think up a story. I know where you're going." He wanted to chase her away and to pull her close to him, but she glanced up and laughed. "You look so perplexed and silly. Professor Lorms called me, and of course I knew what you'd do." "Do you think," said Grant, "that I should be? Is it right?" "Darling, fighting results from frustration and breeds even more frustration and anger. But somehow men get cornered until, well, they have to. Not Tony. He was a gay fool tilting at windmills. Oh, Grant, I know you're wrong, but you're right too, and inside I'm so glad." He wanted to erase the worry behind her gladness, to smother it with reassurance. They went up together to Slag's suite. Teagle was at the door. "Glad to see you, Mohammed," he said to Grant. "The contract's all ready to sign. I guess you'll want your cut for charity, eh?" "You won't, I suppose." "Not on your life. Excuse the double meaning, miss," he smirked at B. "I ask you, who's going to match us after we knock this one off?" Slag stared glumly from a chair, not even removing his hand from the glass beside him. "Practising," he said. "Getting into shape for our tussle, Doc. Like Teagle said, you had to come across." Grant took the papers from the manager, filled in the blanks and signed. "Don't talk much, this Doc Lane," said Slag. "Should I show him, Teagle?" "Sure thing. What's his practice, Doc?" The big man concentrated on the amber bottle beside him. Slowly, jerkily, it lifted, 1 inch, then 2. Slag relaxed and watched it ring as it fell to the table. "My job when I retire," he said. "Got to pour it right into the glass. Pretty hot, eh?" Grant gave no warning. The man's trousers were deluged as the glass shattered in his hand. He leapt up, cursing, and then moved quickly and with ugly purpose toward his visitors. "Careful, boy," warned Teagle. "There's a dame present." For 15 seconds Grant's eyes were locked with Slag's. He looked into their red-rimmed hatred, fought to see the depths of the man. Then, just before the other turned away, an unreasoning, unexpected emotion surged in Grant. It swept over and left him shaken, all in that instant. The emotion was fear. Out on the court it was anger he felt, anger at Slag who stood opposite and bowed to the noisy throng, anger at Teagle who chanted insults until ordered behind the second shield, at the spectators packing the Colosseum in hopes of seeing a player maimed or killed, and B. Anthony, even at B. She had defied him, bribed her way in to act as his second, and had slipped behind the shield at his side of the court. In front of those jeering faces, it was out of the question to make her leave. There was a roar as the ball dropped down from the referee's overhead bubble. Grant left it to Slag, let the man shoot crudely several times, and fought to calm himself. The shots were forceful, but easily stopped and returned. It was like Tony's match, almost too slow at first. Until the players became absorbed, it was hopeless to attempt any kind of hypnotic effects with the ball. Slag swung the sphere into rapid circles about the court. The crowd watched silently, as if impressed by the player's control. To Grant it was absurd. He knew that any trained child could execute the movements. And yet Tony must have felt so too. But that was before. The ball dropped on him like a hawk, and he almost laughed. To give the gasping crowd a thrill, he barely deflected the shot and feigned amazement. Slag retrieved control. Beneath the sudden amusement, Grant was uneasy. Slag had never won a real victory. Never dazed or hypnotized an opponent before striking. All his triumphs rested on single, smashing thrusts. How was it possible? With such clumsy control, the professional could never set up a victory, yet the record stood. Grant could not fathom the problem. If the match went on forever, he could see no way for Slag to drop him, and if he quickly whirled Slag into dazed defeat, the real mystery might never be solved. His opponent would merely have suffered defeat in a match not even recognized by the Commission. Now he could guess why Tony had played carelessly. It was not only victory that was sought. He had deluded himself in accepting such an irresponsible way out. The whole affair depressed him, knotted itself into mind-snaring tangles. The ball blurred again and he hardly cared, only ducking to let it splat against the shield behind him. A spurt of rage sent the sphere spinning back at Slag, but the other diverted it easily into a screen-hugging orbit. Tony, Slag, Woods and Teagle, they seemed to merge confusedly in his mind. They stood each in turn at the door of an iron-barred cell. For Grant there was no way out. Win or lose, live or die, he was doomed. The light dimmed in the cell. Just for an instant B appeared, her hair throwing off sparks of brilliance. She too faded out. Neither B the child, whom he did not love, nor B the woman, who did not love him, could save him. Before him gaped the bottomless pit of shame and penance. He had unloosed a monster on the world. He had to pay for that. But first, Grant had another debt to pay. He tried to throw off the depression, imagining as he did so a sob of joy in the disembodied bee. He wrested the sweeping ball from Slag, even from the opposite end of the court. He spun it in wild orbits and compensated for the other's furious thrusts. Faster and faster he circled it. Slag's mind could not keep up the pace. The even swings acquired a jogging pattern, edged farther out, to within 10 feet of Slag. A quick break lanced behind the man, out again, and then the sphere fell into helical loops, thrice differentiated by harmonic variations, and swept wide around the court. Somehow Slag's distress gave Grant no pleasure. Defeat seemed to face him everywhere. He read it in his opponent's twisted features, even in the futile effort to withdraw attention from the ball. It's no good, he thought. I have failed all along. Savagely he worked the sphere. He would do it quickly. There was no use expecting Tony's fate. The ball darted again for Slag, and this time there could be no interference. It became pure mathematics, the motion complicated far beyond Tony's simple corondo, a flashing three-dimensional blur of colour. He could not keep it up. The concentration brought an invading blackness to his mind. Somewhere there was a dull roar, and he felt as if his own mind were cracking. His nerves quivered to put an end to it, to touch Slag with the ball. Slowly, cautiously, he brought the sphere down. Slag was not there. He gaped. His eyes suddenly found the crumpled heap across the court, and relief swept over him. The man was beaten, in a state of collapse, and there was nothing more Grant could do. "Grant!" Bea screamed. "Oh no! Grant, darling, look up!" Her radiance was almost blinding. He half-twisted to reach her, and then his eyes caught it, the ugly sheen of the fast-growing ball. Desperately he turned, and it shifted in unison. Then she shrieked once more, despairingly, and he threw himself flat, arms outstretched toward her. The ball's speed was so great that it shattered to pieces against the shield behind him. From the back of the barrier ran Bea. She crouched beside him, and her enveloping warmth lifted the evil spell from his mind. The loud confusion of the crowd burst upon him. He saw the referee's swiftly lowering bubble. He was in control of himself, thanks to Bea's interference, and could act on the knowledge so dangerously gained. "The murderer!" Grant pulled Bea up with him. "We've got him!" Opposite them, Slag still lay on the court. "I don't see how he did it," Grant said bewilderedly. "Not Slag. Him!" She pointed up the small running figure. Teagle battered vainly at a gate. The still active screen held him back, and the man's face was a despairing white grimace. Then Grant was upon him, and took him by the throat. Woods paced to the dressing room, still confused. "I begin to see," he said, "but what can I do with the two of them?" "Stop worrying," Grant was curt. "You can do nothing. The law will take Teagle, and without him Slag is just another bum." "He never knew," marvelled Bea. "Slag never knew how he won." "I am to blame." Grant thought of the surging fear Teagle had directed in him at Slag's hotel. "I should have known that telepsychical phenomena could be used as a weapon. The man is a freak. He couldn't influence the ball, but communicated overpowering emotion, without even seeing his subjects, from behind his shield. The victims committed suicide, just as I nearly did before Bea." "What did you feel? A so-called death wish?" asked Woods. "No matter. Not seeing Slag collapse, he overplayed his hand." "Slag's being unconscious merely provided an anticlimax," said Grant. "There was a more important factor added this time. And if you don't mind, Woods, I have an apology to make in private to my one and only second." "Not just the only one, darling," said Bea, "but your permanent till death do us part second. Right?" "Right," Grant said. "That's the only thing tonight," said Woods, "of which I officially approve." The Crystal Circe by Henry Kuttner. Narrated by William Skye. Prologue. The stratoship from Cairo was late, and I was wondering whether the newsreel theatre or a couple of drinks would make time pass faster. It was early dusk. Through the immense curved wall window of the Manhattan port room, I could see the landing field with a silvery ship being rolled over the tarmac and the skyscrapers of New York beyond. Then I saw Arnson. It was Steve Arnson, of course. No doubt about that. No other man had his great breadth of shoulders, his Herculean build. 10 years ago we had been classmates at Midwestern. I remembered Raquel laughing handsome Steve Arnson very well, with his penchant for getting into trouble and out of it again, usually dragging Douglas O'Brien, his roommate, along with him like the helpless tail of a kite. Poor Doug. He was the antithesis of Arnson, a thoughtful, studious boy with the shadow of a dream lurking always in his dark eyes. An idealist was Douglas O'Brien, as his Celtic ancestors had been. Strong friendship had existed between the two men, the mental communion of laughter and a dream. Arnson was looking up into the darkening sky, a queer tensity in his posture. He turned abruptly, came to a table near me, and sat down. From his pocket he took a small box. It snapped open. His gaze probed into the unknown thing that was hidden by his cupped hands. I picked up my drink and went to Arnson's table. All I could see was the back of his sleek, massive head. Then he looked up. If ever I saw hell in a man's face, I saw it in Arnson's then. There was a dreadful longing and an equally horrible hopelessness, the expression one might see on the face of a damned soul looking up from the pit at the shining gates forever beyond his reach. And Arnson's face had been ravaged. The searing mark of some experience lay there, branded into his furrowed cheeks, his tightened lips, into his eyes where a sickness dwelt. No, this was not Steve Arnson, the boy I had known at Midwestern. Youth had left him, and hope as well.
"Vale," he said, smiling crookedly. "Good Lord, of all people! Sit down and have a drink. What are you doing here?"
I sought for words as I dropped into a chair. Arnson watched me for a moment and then shrugged.
"You might as well say it. I've changed." "Yeah, I know that."
What happened? There was no need to fence. His gaze went beyond me to the dark sky above the landing field.
"What happened? Why didn't you ask me where Doug is? We always stuck together, didn't we? Surprising to see me alone."
He lit a cigarette and crushed it out with an impatient gesture.
"You know, Vale, I've been hoping I'd run into you. This thing that's been boiling inside of me, I haven't been able to tell a soul. No one would have believed me. You may. The three of us kicked around together a lot in the old days."
"In trouble?" I asked. "Can I help?"
"You can listen," he said. "I came back to Earth thinking I might be able to forget. It hasn't worked. I'm waiting for the airliner to take me to Kansas Spaceport. I'm going to Callisto, Mars, somewhere. Earth isn't the right place anymore. But I'm glad we ran into each other, Vale. I want to talk. I want you to answer a question that's been driving me almost insane."
I signaled the waiter and got more drinks. Arnson was silent till we were alone once more. Then he opened his cupped hands and showed me a small shagreen box. It clicked open. Nestling in blue velvet was a crystal, not large, but lovelier than any gem I had seen before. Light drifted from it like the flow of slow water. The dim shining pulsed and waned. In the heart of the jewel was... I tore my eyes away, staring at Arnson. "What is it? Where did you get the thing? Not on Earth?" He was watching the jewel, sick hopelessness on his face.
"No, not on Earth. It came from a little asteroid out there, somewhere." He waved vaguely toward the sky. "It isn't charted. I took no reckonings. So I can never go back. Not that I want to now. Poor Doug."
"He's dead, isn't he?" I asked. Arnson looked at me strangely as he closed the box and slipped it back into his pocket.
"Dead? I wonder. Wait till you know the story, Vale. About Doug's lucky charm, and the dreams, and the crystal Circe."
The slow horror of remembrance crept across his face. Out there in space something had happened. I thought it must have been frightful to leave such traces on Arnson. He read my thought.
"Frightful? Perhaps. It was quite lovely, too. You remember the old days when I thought of nothing but raising hell?"
After a long pause, I said, "Who was the crystal Circe?"
"I never knew her name. She told me, but my brain couldn't understand it. She wasn't human, of course. I called her Circe after the enchantress who changed her lovers to swine."
Again he looked at the darkening sky.
"Well, it began more than 2 years ago in Maine. Doug and I were on a fishing trip when we ran into the meteorite. Little fishing we got done then. You know how Doug was, like a kid reading a fairy tale for the first time. And that meteorite..."
Chapter 1. The Star Gem. It lay in the crater it had dug for itself, a rounded arc visible about the brown earth. Already sumac and vines were mending the broken soil. Warm fall sunlight slanted down through the trees as Douglas O'Brien and Steve Arnson plodded toward the distant gurgling of the stream, thoughts intent on catching the limit. No fingering tendril of menace thrust out to warn them. "Mind your step," Arnson said, seeing the pit. He detoured around it and turned, realizing that O'Brien had not followed. "Come on, Doug. It's getting late." O'Brien's tanned young face was intent as he peered down into the hollow.
"Wait a bit," he said absently. "This looks... Say, I'll bet there's a meteor down there."
"So there's a meteor. We're not fishing for meteors, Professor. They're mostly iron anyway. Gold, now, would be a different matter." O'Brien dropped lightly into the hole, scraping at the dirt with his fingers.
"Wonder how long it's been here. You run along, Steve. I'll catch up with you."
Arnson sighed. O'Brien, with his vast enthusiasm for everything under the sun, was off again. There would be no stopping him now till he had satisfied his curiosity about the meteorite. Well, Arnson had a new fly he was anxious to use, and it would soon be too late for good fishing. With a grunt he turned and pushed on toward the stream. The fly proved excellent. In a surprisingly short time, Arnson had bagged the limit. There was no sign of O'Brien, and hunger made itself evident. Arnson retraced his steps. The younger man was sitting cross-legged beside the crater, holding something in his cupped hands and staring down at it. A swift glance showed Arnson that the meteorite had been uncovered, and apparently cracked in two, each piece the size of a football. He stepped closer to see what O'Brien held. It was a grey crystal, egg-sized, filled with cloudy frozen mists. It had been cut into a diamond-shaped multi-faced gem. "Where'd you get that?" Arnson asked. O'Brien jumped, turning up a startled face.
"Oh, hello, Steve. It was in the meteorite. Damnedest thing I ever saw. I saw the meteorite had a line of fission all round it, so I smacked the thing with a rock. It fell apart and this was in the middle. Impossible, isn't it?"
"Let's see." Arnson reached for the jewel. O'Brien showed an odd reluctance in giving it up, but finally dropped it into the other's outstretched hand. The gem was cold, and yet not unpleasantly so. A tingling raced up Arnson's arm to his shoulder. He felt an abrupt, tiny shock. O'Brien snatched the jewel. Arnson stared at him. "I'm not going to eat it. What?" The boy grinned.
"It's my luck piece, Steve. My lucky charm. I'm going to have it pierced."
"Better take it to a jeweler first," Arnson suggested. "It may be valuable."
"No, I'll keep it."
He slipped the gem into his pocket.
"Any luck?"
"The limit, and I'm starving. Let's get back to camp." Over their meal of fried trout, O'Brien fingered the find, staring into the cloudy depths of the gem as though he expected to find something there. Arnson could sense a strange air of withdrawal about him. That night O'Brien fell asleep holding the jewel in his hand. His sleep was troubled. Arnson watched the boy, the vaguest hint of worry in his blue eyes. Once Doug lifted his hand and let it fall reluctantly, and once a flash of light seemed to lance out from the gem, brief and vivid as lightning. Imagination, perhaps. The moon sank. O'Brien stirred and sat up. Arnson felt the other's eyes upon him. He said softly, "Doug?"
"Yes, I wondered if you were awake."
"Anything wrong?"
"There's a girl,"
O'Brien said, and fell silent. After what seemed a long time, he went on.
"Remember you said once that I'd never find a girl perfect enough to love?"
"I remember."
"You were wrong. She's like Deirdre of the Tuatha Dé, like Freya, like Ran of the Northern Seas. She has red hair, red as dying suns are red, and she's a goddess like Deirdre too. The Song of Solomon was made for her. Thou art all fair, my love, there is no spot in thee. I sleep, but my heart waketh. It is the voice of my beloved that knocketh." "Steve," he said, and his voice broke sharply. "It wasn't a dream. I know it wasn't. She exists somewhere." He stirred. Arnson guessed that he was peering at the grey jewel. There was nothing to say. The frosty brilliance of the stars gleamed through the laced branches above. A curious breath of the unearthly seemed to drop down from the vast abyss of the sky, chilling Arnson's heart. In that moment he knew that his friend was ensorcelled. Superstition, foolishness! He shook the thought away. But all the blood of his northern ancestors rose up in him, the Vikings who had believed in Queen Ran of Ocean, in trolls and warlocks and the water maidens who guard sunken gold. "You're dreaming," he said stubbornly, more loudly than he thought. "It's time we go back to the city. We've been here long enough.
To his surprise, O'Brien agreed. I think so. I've an idea I want to work on. And the boy shut up like a clam, relaxing almost instantly into peaceful slumber. But Arnson did not sleep for a long time. The stars seemed too close and somehow menacing. From the black void, eyes watched, not human eyes, for all their loveliness. They were pools of darkest night, and stars glimmered within them. He wished that O'Brien had not found the meteorite. Chapter 2. Lure of the Crystal. There was a change in the boy after that. The dream in his eyes did not fade, but he worked now with an intensity of purpose that had never existed before. Previously, the two had held routine jobs in a huge commercial organization. Without warning, O'Brien quit. Arnson followed suit, feeling the necessity for staying close to the younger man. Yet in the days to come, he amounted to little more than excess baggage. O'Brien had plans. He borrowed money, scraped together enough to equip a small laboratory, and there he worked long hours. Arnson helped when he could, though that was not often. He seldom knew exactly what the boy was trying to accomplish. Once O'Brien said a queer thing. They were in the laboratory, awaiting the result of an experiment, and Arnson was pacing back and forth nervously. I wish I knew what was up, Doug, he said almost with anger. We've been at this for months. What do you expect anyway? You've had no more than an ordinary training in physics. The jewel helps, O'Brien said. He took the gem from its suede bag and stared into the cloudy depths. I catch thoughts from it. Arnson stopped short, staring. His face changed. You kidding? He demanded. O'Brien flushed. Okay, try it, he said, thrusting the stone at Arnson, who took it rather reluctantly. Shut your eyes and let your mind go blank. That does it sometimes. All right. Arnson squeezed his eyes closed and thought of nothing. Instantly a sick, horrible feeling swept through him, a terrible yearning such as he had never known before. So might the assassins feel, deprived of the magic drug that took them to paradise. An assassin exiled, cast into outer darkness. A face swam into view, lovely and strange beyond imagination. Only a glimpse he had, blotted out by rainbow coruscating lights that darted and flashed like elfin fireflies. Then darkness once more, and the frightful longing. For what? He let go of the gem. O'Brien caught it as it fell. The boy smiled wryly. I wondered if you get it too. Did you see her? I saw nothing, Arnson snarled, whirling toward the door. I felt nothing. Yet you're afraid. Why? I don't fear her, or the stone. The more fool you, Arnson cast over his shoulder as he went out. He felt sick and weak, as though unnameable vistas had opened before him. There was no explanation for what he had felt. No sane explanation, at least. And yet there might be, he thought, as he paced about the yard smoking an endless chain of cigarettes. Telepathy, thought transference. He had simply caught what was in O'Brien's mind. But it was horrible to know that Doug was feeling that soul-sick craving for the goddess girl who could not exist. O'Brien came out of the laboratory, eyes aglow. It's done, he said, trying to repress his triumph. We've got the alloy at last. That last treatment did the trick. Arnson felt vague apprehension. He tried to congratulate O'Brien, but his tone rang false to his own ears. The boy smiled understandingly. It's been good of you to string along, Steve. The thing will pay off now. Only, I'll need a lot of money. You'll have a lot. Plenty of companies will be bidding for the process. O'Brien said, I want enough to buy a spaceship. Arnson whistled. That's a lot, even for a small boat. His eyes narrowed. Why do you want it? I'm going to find Deirdre, the other said simply. She's out there, somewhere. He tilted his head back. And I'll find her. Space is pretty big. I've a guide. O'Brien took out the grey gem. It wants to go to her too. It wants to go back. It isn't really alive here on Earth, you know. And I'm not just dreaming, Steve. How do you suppose I managed to make this alloy, the perfect plastic, tougher than beryllium steel, lighter than aluminium, a conductor or non-conductor of electricity depending on the mix? You know I couldn't have done it alone. You did it. O'Brien touched the jewel. I found out how to do it. There's life in here, Steve. Not earthly life, but intelligent. I could understand a little, not much. Enough to work out the alloy. I had to do that first so I could get money enough to buy a spaceship.
You don't know how to pilot in space.
We'll hire a pilot.
We?
He grinned. I'm going to prove my point. You don't believe in Deirdre, but you'll see her, Steve. The jewel will guide us. It wants to go home, so we'll take it there. Arnson scowled and turned away, his big shoulders tense with unreasoning anger. He found himself hating the imaginary being O'Brien had created. Deirdre! His fists clenched. She did not exist. The major planets and satellites had been explored. The inhabited ones held nothing remotely human. Martians were huge-headed, spindle-legged horrors. Venusians were scaled amphibians living in a state of feudalism and constant warfare. The other planets, the avian, hollow-boned Callistans, were closest to humanity, but by no stretch of the imagination could they be called beautiful. And Deirdre was beautiful. Imaginary or not, she was lovely as a goddess. Damn her! But that did no good. O'Brien was not to be turned from his purpose. With relentless, swift intensity, he patented the alloy process, sold it to the highest bidder, and purchased a light space cruiser. He found a pilot, a leather-skinned, tough, tobacco-chewing man named Tex Hastings, who could be depended on to do what he was told and keep his mouth shut. O'Brien chafed with impatience till the cruiser jetted off from the spaceport. The closer he came to achieving his goal, the more nervous he grew. The jewel he kept clenched in one hand most of the time. Arnson noticed that a dim brilliance was beginning to glow within it as the ship plunged farther out toward the void. Hastings cast quizzical glances at O'Brien, but did what he was told. He confided in Arnson. We haven't even bothered with charts. It's screwy, but I'm not kicking. Only this isn't piloting. Your friend just points at a star sector and says, go there. Funny. He scratched his leathery cheek, faded eyes intent on Arnson's face. The big man nodded. I know, but it isn't up to me, Hastings. I'm supercargo. Yeah, well if you want any help, you can count on me. I've seen space madness before. Arnson snorted. Space madness? Hastings' eyes were steady. I may be wrong, sure, but anything can happen out here. We're not on Earth, Mr. Arnson. Earth laws don't apply. Neither does logic. We're on the edge of the unknown. I never thought you were superstitious. I'm not, only I've been around and seen a lot. That crystal Mr. O'Brien lugs around with him. I never saw anything like that before. He waited, but Arnson didn't speak. All right, then. I've known things to drift in from outside. Funny things, damn funny. The solar system's like a sargasso. It catches flotsam from other systems, even other universes for all I know. One rule I've learned. When you can't guess the answer, it's a good idea to stay clear. Arnson grunted moodily, staring out a port at the glaring brilliance of the stars. Ever heard any stories about jewels like that one? Hastings shook his closely cropped head. No, but I saw a wreck once, sunside of Pluto, a ship that hadn't been designed in this system. It was deserted. God knows how long it had been out there, or where it came from. Inside, it wasn't designed for human beings at all. It came from outside, of course, and outside is a big place. That jewel, now, he bit the end off a quid of tobacco. What about it? It's an outside sort of thing, and your friend isn't acting normal. It may add up to trouble. It may not. My point is that I'm going to keep my eyes open, and you'd be wise to do the same thing. Arnson went back to the galley and fried eggs, angry with himself for listening to Hastings' hints. He was more than ever uncomfortable. Back on Earth, it had been easier to disbelieve in any unknown powers that the grey jewel might possess. Here it was different. Space was the hinterland, the waste that bordered the cryptic outside. The forward step in science that threw open the gates of interplanetary travel had, in a way, taken man back in time, to a day when he cowered in a cave, fearing the powers of the dark that lurked in the unknown jungle. Space travel had broken barriers. It opened a door that, perhaps, should have remained forever closed. On the shores of space, strange flotsam was cast. Arnson's gaze probed out through the port to the red globe of Mars, the blinding brilliance of the Milky Way, the enigmatic shadow of the coal sack. Out there, anything might lie. Life grown from a matrix neither earthly nor even three-dimensional. Charles Fort had hinted at it. Scientists had hazarded wild guesses. The cosmic womb of space from which blasphemous abortions might be cast. So they went on, day after day, skirting Mars and plunging on into the thick of the asteroid belt. It was uncharted country now, a sargasso of remnants from an exploded planet that had existed here eons ago. Sounds rang loudly in the narrow confines of the spaceship. Nervousness gripped all three of the men. But O'Brien found comfort in the grey crystal. His eyes held a glowing light of triumph. We're coming closer, Steve, he said. Deirdre isn't far away now.
Damn Deirdre, Arnson said, but not aloud. The ship went on, following the blind course O'Brien pointed. Hastings shook his head in grim silence and trained his passengers in the use of the spacesuits. Few of the asteroids had atmosphere, and it became increasingly evident that the destination was an asteroid. Chapter 3. The Singing Crystals. They found it at last, a jagged, slowly revolving ball that looked incredibly desolate, slag from some solar furnace. The telescope showed no life. The ball had hardened as it whirled, and the molten rock had frozen instantly in frigid space into spiky giant crags and stalagmites. No atmosphere, no water, no sign of life in any form. The crystal O'Brien held had changed. A pale light streamed from it. O'Brien's face was tensely eager.
This is it. Set the ship down, Hastings.
The pilot made a grimace but bent toward the controls. It was a ticklish task at best, for he had to match the ship's speed to the speed of the asteroid's revolution and circle in, describing a narrow spiral. Rocket ships are not built for maneuverability. They blast their way to ground and up again through sheer roaring power. She settled bumpily on the iron-hard surface of the asteroid, and Arnson looked through the thick visiglass at desolation that struck a chill to his heart. Life had never existed here. It was a world damned in the making, a tiny planetoid forever condemned to unbearable night and silence. It was one with the darkness. The sun glare, in the absence of atmosphere, made sharp contrasts between light and jet shadow. The fingers of rock reached up hungrily, as though searching for warmth. There was nothing menacing about the picture. It was horrible in its lifelessness, that was all. It was not intended for life. Arnson felt himself an intruder. O'Brien met his glance. The boy was smiling, rather wryly.
I know, he said. It doesn't look very promising, does it? But this is the place.
Maybe, 1,000,000 years ago, Arnson said skeptically. There's nothing here now.
Silently, O'Brien put the crystal in the giant's hand. From it a pulse of triumph burst out. Exultation! The psychic wave shook Arnson with its intensity, wiped doubt from his face. Invisibly and intangibly the jewel shouted its delight. The glow within it waxed brighter. Hastings said abruptly, "Time to eat. Metabolism's higher in space. We can't afford to miss a meal."
"I'm going out," O'Brien said, but Arnson seconded the pilot.
"We're here now. You can afford to wait an hour or so. And I'm hungry."
They opened thermocans in the galley and gulped the hot food standing. The ship had suddenly become a prison. Even Hastings was touched with the thirst to know what awaited them outside. "We circled the asteroid," he said at last, his voice argumentative. "There's nothing here, Mr. O'Brien. We saw that." But O'Brien was hurrying back to the control cabin. The suits were cumbersome, even in the slight gravity. Hastings tested the oxygen tanks strapped on the backs and checked the equipment with stringent care. A leak would be fatal on this airless world. So they went out through the airlock, and Arnson, for one, felt his middle tightening with the expectation of the unknown. His breathing sounded loud and harsh within the helmet. The tripolarized faceplates of the helmets were proof against sun glare, but they could not minimize the horrible desolation of the scene. A world untouched, more lifeless, more terrible than frigid Jotunheim where the frost giants dwelt. Arnson's heavily leaded boots thumped solidly on the slag. There was no dust here, no sign of erosion, for there was no air. In O'Brien's hand the crystal flamed with milky pallor. The boy's face was thin and haggard with desire. Arnson, watching, felt hot fury against the incubus that had worked its dark spell on the other. He could do nothing, only follow and wait. His hand crept to the weighted blackjack in his belt. He saw the hope slowly fade from O'Brien's eyes. Against his will, he said,
"We're only on the surface, Doug. Underground?"
"That's right. Maybe there's an entrance somewhere. But I don't know. We may be 1,000 years too late, Steve."
His gaze clung to the crystal. It pulsed triumphantly. Pale flame lanced joyously from it. Alive it was. Arnson had no doubt of that now. Alive and exulting to be home once more. Years too late? There was not the slightest trace of any artifact on this airless planetoid. The bleakness of outer space itself cast a veil over the nameless world. The three men plodded on. In the end, they went back to the ship. The quick night of the tiny world had fallen. The flaming corona of the sun had vanished.
Stars leaped into hard, jewelled brilliance against utter blackness. The sky blazed with cold fires. Lifeless, alien, strange. It was the edge of the unknown. They slept at last. Metabolism was high and they needed to restore their tissues. Hours later, Arnson came to half-wakefulness. In his bunk, he rose on one elbow, wondering what had roused him. His mind felt dulled. He could scarcely tell whether or not he was dreaming. Across the ship, a man's head and shoulders were silhouetted against a port, grotesquely large and distorted. Beyond, the stars blazed. They moved. They swirled in a witch dance of goblin lanterns, dancing, whirling, spiraling. Blue, yellow, amethyst, and milky pearl, streaks of light golden as the eye of a lioness, and nameless colours, not earthly, made a patterned arabesque as they danced their elfin saraband there in the airless dark. The dark swallowed Arnson. Slumber took him. Slowly, exhaustedly, he came back to consciousness. His head ached, his tongue was thick. For a moment he lay quietly, trying to remember. Dream? Arnson cursed, threw his blankets aside and sprang from the bunk. O'Brien was gone. Tex Hastings was gone. 2 spacesuits had vanished from their racks. Arnson's face twisted into a savage mask. He knew now what had been so wrong about his vision of the night. The man he had glimpsed at the port had been outside the ship. Doug? Or Hastings? It did not matter. Both men were gone. He was alone on the mystery world. Arnson set his jaw, gulped caffeine tablets to clear his head, and wrenched a spacesuit from its hooks. He donned it, realizing that sunlight once more was pouring down from the distant sun. Soon he was ready. He went out of the ship, climbed atop it, and stared around. Nothing. The bleak light and shadow pattern of the asteroid stretched to the sharply curving horizon all around. There was nothing else. Nor were there tracks in the iron-hard slag. He would have to search at random, by pure guesswork. In the low gravity, his leap to the ground scarcely jarred him. He gripped the billy at his left and moved forward, toward a high pinnacle in the distance. He found nothing. Worst of all, perhaps, was the horrible loneliness that oppressed him. He was too close to outside now. He was the only living thing in a place never meant for human life. The ghastly bleakness of the asteroid sank like knife blades into his mind, searing it coldly. There was no relief when he looked up. The distant sun, with its corona, was infinitely far away. The rest of the sky held stars, remote, not twinkling as on Earth, but shining with a cold intensity, a pale fury, relentless and eternal. In the light, the heat seared him through his armour. In the shadows, he shivered with cold. He went on, sick with hate, seeking the unknown thing that had taken Doug. The boy was a poet, a dreamer, a fool, easy victim for the terror that haunted the asteroid. Exhausted, he turned back. His air supply was running low, and there was no sign of either Doug or Hastings. He headed for the ship. It was further than he had thought. He sighted it at last beneath a towering stalagmite that thrust up into the harsh sunlight, and his steps quickened. Why hadn't he thought to bring extra cylinders of oxygen? The lock stuck under his gloved, awkward fingers. He wrenched at it savagely. At last the great valve swung open. He went through the airlock, opened his visiplate, and took great breaths of the fresher air. Oxygen cylinders were racked nearby. He swung several into position on his back and clamped them into place. He gulped more caffeine tablets. Some instinct made him turn and look back through the port. Over the uneven ground, a spacesuited figure was staggering, a quarter of a mile distant. Arnson's heart jumped. In one swift motion, he clamped shut his visiplate and leaped for the airlock. It seemed an eternity before he was outside, leaping, racing, straining toward the man who had fallen helpless, a motionless shadow amid the glare. Doug? Hastings? It was O'Brien, his young face grey with exhaustion and flushed with oxygen thirst. For a moment Arnson thought the boy was dead. He thrust one arm under O'Brien's back, lifting him. With the other hand he fumbled at an auxiliary air hose, thrusting it into the valve in O'Brien's chin plate as he ripped away the useless hose. Oxygen flowed into the boy's suit. His nostrils distended as he drank in the precious air. Arnson watched, teeth bared in a mirthless grin. Good. Colour came back to O'Brien's cheeks, a healthy flush under the deep tan. His eyes opened, looked into Arnson's. Couldn't find her, he whispered, his voice hollow through the audiophone. Deirdre, I couldn't find her, Steve. Arnson said, What happened, Doug? O'Brien took a deep breath and shook his head. I woke up. Something warned me. This. He unclasped his gloved hand and showed the milky crystal. It knew. She was close. I felt it. I woke up, went to a port and saw the lights. Hastings was out there. She'd called him, I guess. He was running after the lights. I had sense enough to put on my suit. Then I followed. But Hastings was too fast for me. I followed till I lost him. Miles, hours. Then I saw my oxygen was low. I tried to get back to the ship. He tried to smile. Why did she call Hastings, Steve? Why not me? Arnson felt cold. We're getting off this asteroid. Right away. Leaving Hastings? I'll look for him myself. There's life here. Malignant life. Plenty dangerous. Not evil. No. Beyond evil. Beyond good. I'm not going, Steve. You're going if I have to hog-tie you. O'Brien's gloved hand tightened on the milky crystal. Deirdre, he said. And, in the emptiness above them, a glow brightened. There was no other warning. Arnson tilted back his head to see the incredible. Deirdre, he thought. Then, unbidden, another name leaped into his mind. Circe. Circe of Colchis, goddess of air. Circe, daughter of the day who changed men to swine. Circe, more than human. For this was no human figure that hovered above them. It seemed to be a girl, unclad, reclining in nothingness, her floating hair tinted like the rays of a dying sun. Her body swept in lines of pure beauty, long-limbed and gracious. Her eyes were veiled, long lashes hid them. There was tenderness in her face, and aloofness, and alienage. There was beauty there, not entirely human beauty. Rainbow crystals garmented her. Some large, some small, multifaceted gems danced and shimmered against the blackness of the sky and the whiteness of Circe's body. Moon yellow, amber gold, blue as the sea off Capri, green as the pine-clad hills of Earth, angry scarlet and lambent dragon green. With some distantly sane corner of his mind, Arnson realized that it was impossible for any living being to exist without protection on the frigid, airless surface of the asteroid. Then he knew that both air and warmth surrounded the girl. The crystals protected her. He knew that somehow. O'Brien twisted in his arms. He saw the girl try to spring free. Arnson gripped him. The boy swung a jolting blow that jarred the giant's helmet. His mailed glove smashed against the metal plate. Dazed and giddy, Arnson fell back, clawing at O'Brien. His fingers slipped along the other's arm. He felt something drop into his hand and clutched it. Then O'Brien was free. He wrenched an oxygen tank from Arnson's shoulders, whirled, and took a step toward the girl. She was further away now. Arnson staggered up. His head was throbbing furiously. Too late he realized that, in the scuffle, his air valve had fouled. He fumbled at it with clumsy fingers, and fell. His helmet thudded solidly against hard slag. Blackness took him. Chapter 4. Circe the Immortal. It was dark when he woke. Oxygen was once more pouring into his suit. He had managed to open the valve before falling. Far above, the distant corona-crowned sun flamed against the starry backdrop. The ship lay beneath its crag. But of O'Brien there was no trace whatever. After that, something akin to madness came to Arnson. Again the utter loneliness of space crushed down on him with suffocating terror. Doug was gone, like Hastings. Where? He searched then, and in the days thereafter. He grew haggard and gaunt, drugging himself with stimulants so he could drive himself beyond his limit. Hour after hour he searched the tiny world, squinting against sun glare, peering into black shadow, shouting O'Brien's name, cursing bitter, searing oaths that sounded futile to his ears. Time dragged on into an eternity. He had been here forever. He could not remember a time when he had not been plodding across the asteroid, watching for a glimpse of a spacesuited figure, of dancing jewels of fire, of a slim white body. Who was she? What was she? Not human, no. And the crystals? What were they? He returned to the ship one day, shoulders slumping, and passed the spot where he had seen the girl. Something on the ground caught his eye. A pearly, shining gem. He remembered his scuffle with O'Brien and the thing that had dropped into his glove. The jewel, of course. It had lain here, unnoticed, for many revolutions of the asteroid. He picked it up, staring into the milky depths. A pulse tingled up his arm, fingering into his mind. A pulse of longing. The girl had appeared when O'Brien had summoned her. Perhaps it would work again. There was no other hope. But he could not call her Deirdre. He gripped the hard crystal. His thought probed out, forceful and summoning. Circe! Nothing. The eternal silence, the cold blaze of the stars. Circe! The gem in his hand leaped with eagerness. In emptiness above him, a rainbow glitter of coruscating light flamed. The crystals, and, within them, the girl. She had not changed. Lovely and alien, she lay among her dancing, shining gems, and her lashes still veiled the cryptic depth of her eyes. Arnson stumbled forward. Where's O'Brien? His voice cracked, harsh and inhuman. Damn you! Where is he? She did not look at him. Her body seemed to recede. The jewel swelled into swift motion about her. Arnson lurched on. His mind felt on fire. He whipped out his elastic billy and plunged toward the girl. She was not there. She had drifted back amid the rainbow crystals. Arnson could not overtake her. It was like following a will-o'-the-wisp, a torch of St. Elmo's fire. But he did not take his eyes from the girl. More than once he fell. She was leading him away from the ship, he knew. That did not matter. Not if she also led him to Doug. What had she done with the boy? He hated her relentless inhumanity, her incredible beauty. Teeth bared, red-rimmed eyes glaring, Arnson plunged on in a nightmare race across the face of the silent asteroid. Hours later, it seemed, she vanished in black shadow under a thrusting pinnacle of slag. Arnson followed, reeling with fatigue, expecting to cannon into a rock wall. But the darkness remained intangible. The ground sloped down beneath his leaded boots. Suddenly light shone through a cleft at his side. Pale, warm, liquid light, it drifted up from a slanting corridor in the rock. Far down the passage, Arnson could see the cloud of dancing flames that marked the girl's crystal attendants. He stumbled on. Down he went, and down, till at last the passage turned again in the distance. He rounded the bend, and stopped, blinded and dazed. As his vision adjusted itself, Arnson made out a pillar of fire that rose from floor to ceiling of the cavern before him. Yet it was not fire. It was something beyond human knowledge. Pure energy, perhaps, wrenched from the locked heart of the atom itself, silently thundering and pouring up like a geyser. The pillar shook. It wavered and rocked, coldly white, intensely brilliant, like a living thing blazing with a power inconceivable. Walls and floor and roof of the cavern were crusted with jewels. The rainbow crystals clung quivering, thousands of them, some tiny, others huge. They watched. They were alive. The girl stood near Arnson. A score of the jewels pressed against her lovingly. They caressed her. The veiled eyes did not meet Arnson's, but she lifted her arm. There was a movement in Arnson's gloved hand. The milky gem stirred. A pulse of eagerness beat out from it. It leaped free, raced towards Circe. She caught it, flung it at the shaking tower of flame. Into the pillar's blazing heart the crystal darted. The fires sank, rose again, spewed forth the jewel. No longer milky, no longer dulled. It blazed with fantastic brilliance. Vital energy streamed from it. It whirled and danced joyously with sheer delight. It was like a sleeper suddenly awakened. It spun towards Circe, pulsed madly with the intoxication of life. The girl rose, feather-light, without gravity, drifting across the cavern to a passage mouth that gaped in the wall. The jewels clustered around it swayed toward her. Some broke free, rushing in her train. She vanished into the portal. The spell that held Arnson broke. He flung himself after her. Too late. Already she was gone. But along the corridor jewels floated, bright, shining, alive. And suddenly strong arms were around Arnson. The face of O'Brien was before him. O'Brien, no longer wearing his spacesuit, haggard and yet aflame with a vital something that glowed in his dark eyes. O'Brien laughing. "Steve!" His voice shook. "So you followed me. I'm glad. Come in here, it's all right." The energy went out of Arnson, leaving him weak and exhausted. He cast one glance up the empty corridor and followed O'Brien through a cave opening into a little room cut out of solid rock. He felt the other's fingers loosening his helmet, removing the bulky spacesuit. Some remnant of caution returned. "The oxygen! There's air here. It's a place of wonders, Steve." There was air. cool, sweet and refreshing, had crept into Arnson's lungs. He looked around. The little cavern was empty, save for dozens of the rainbow crystals clinging to the walls. They watched alertly. O'Brien pressed him back, made a quick gesture. A jewel floated forward, hovering over Arnson's face. He felt water trickling between his lips, and too exhausted for wonder, swallowed gratefully. "You need sleep," O'Brien said. "But it's all right, Steve. It's all right, I tell you. You'll hear all about it when you wake up. Time enough then. You'll see Deirdre." Arnson tried to struggle up. "I won't!" O'Brien signalled again. Another gem drifted close. From it a grey breath of cloud floated, perfume sweet, soporific. It crept into Arnson's nostrils. And he slept. Chapter 5. The Jewel Folk. The room was unchanged when he woke once more. O'Brien sat cross-legged, looking into space. His face had altered, had acquired a new peace and maturity. He heard Arnson's slight movement and turned. "Awake! How do you feel?" "All right. Well enough to hear explanations," Arnson said with a flash of temper. "I've been nearly crazy, looking for you all over this damned asteroid. I still think I'm crazy after all this." O'Brien chuckled. "I can imagine. I felt pretty upset for a while, till the crystals explained." "The crystals what?" "They're alive, Steve. The ultimate product of evolution, perhaps. Crystalline life. Perfect machines. They can do almost anything. You saw how one created drinkable water, and, well, look here." He beckoned. A jewel floated close. From it a jet of flame shot, red and brilliant. O'Brien waved his hand, the gem drifted back to its place. "They can convert energy into matter, you see. It's logical when you forget about hidebound science. All matter's made up of energy. It's simply locked in certain patterns, certain matrices. But inside the atom, the framework of matter, you've got nothing but energy. These crystals build patterns out of basic energy." Arnson shook his head. "I don't see it." O'Brien's voice grew deeper, stronger. "Long ago, very long ago, and in another galaxy, light years away, there was a civilization far beyond ours. Deirdre is a child of that race. It was mighty. It passed through our culture level and went far beyond, till machines were no longer needed. Instead, the race made the crystals, super machines, super robots, with incredible powers locked in them. They supplied all the needs of Deirdre's race." "Well?" "This asteroid doesn't belong to our family of planets. It's from that other system in the neighbouring galaxy. It drifted here by accident, I think. I don't quite know the facts of it. It came under the gravitational pull of a comet or a wandering planet, and was yanked out into space. Eventually it settled into this orbit. Deirdre didn't care. Her mind isn't like ours. The crystals supplied all her needs, made air, gave her food and water, everything she desired." Arnson said, "How long has this been going on?" "Forever, perhaps," O'Brien said quietly. "I think Deirdre's immortal. At least she is a goddess. Do you remember the crystal I found in that meteorite?" "Yeah, I remember." "It came from here. It was one of Deirdre's servants. Somehow it was lost, wandered away. Cosmic dust collected on it as it moved in an orbit around the sun, for thousands of years, perhaps. Iron atoms. At last it was a meteorite with a crystal at its heart. So it fell on Earth, and I found it, and it wanted to go home, back to Deirdre. It told me that. I felt its thoughts. It drew me here, Steve." Arnson shivered.
"It's unbelievable. And that girl isn't human."
"Have you looked into her eyes?"
"No."
"She isn't human. She is a goddess." A new thought came to Arnson.
"Where's Tex Hastings? Here?"
"I haven't seen him," O'Brien said. "I don't know where he is."
"Uh-huh. What have you been doing?"
"She brought me here. The crystals took care of me. And Deirdre," he stood up, "she's summoning me. Wait, Steve, I'll be back." Arnson put out a detaining hand. It was useless. O'Brien stepped through the portal and was gone. A dozen crystals swept after him. Arnson followed, refusing to admit that he too wanted another glimpse of the girl. Down the passage he went in O'Brien's trail, till the boy vanished from sight. Arnson increased his pace. He halted on the threshold of the cavern where the pillar of flame swept up to the roof. He had thought it thundered. It did not. It rushed up in utter silence, shaking and swaying with the surcharged intensity of its power. The walls were crusted with the dancing, watching crystals. Now Arnson saw that some were dull grey, motionless and dead. These were sprinkled among the others, and there were thousands of them. O'Brien paced forward, and suddenly Circe was standing with her back to Arnson, the gems clustering about her caressingly. She lifted her arms, and O'Brien turned. A great hunger leaped into his face. The girl did not move, and O'Brien came into the circle of her arms. So swift was her movement that Arnson did not realize it till too late. The slender arms slid free, Circe stepped back a pace, and thrust O'Brien toward the tower of flame. He stumbled, off balance, and the crystals leaped from Circe's body. They were no longer a garment. They pressed against O'Brien, forcing him away, thrusting, pushing. Arnson cried out and sprang forward. O'Brien reeled, was engulfed by the flame pillar. The pouring torrent swallowed him. Simultaneously, from the farther wall, a grey, dead jewel detached itself and shot toward the tower of fire. Into the blazing heart it fled and vanished. The pillar sank down. It pulsed, thundered up again, silently streaming like a torrent toward the roof. And out of its depths the jewel came, transformed. Sentiment, blazing, shining with a myriad hues, it swirled toward Circe. Scintillant with delight it hovered about her caressingly. It was alive. Arnson cried out, flung himself forward. Circe turned to face him. Still her eyes were hidden, her face was aloofly lovely and inhuman. The crystal swept towards Arnson, cupping itself in his outthrust hand. From it a wave of mad delight rushed into his brain. It was Doug! It was Doug! Frozen with sick horror, Arnson halted, while thoughts poured from the sentient crystal into his mind. The grey jewel! His tongue fumbled thickly with the words. He looked up to where the dull gems clung among the shining ones. Machines, Steve! The thought lanced into him from the living thing he held. Robots, not energized. Only one thing can energize them. Life force, vital energy. The flame pillar does that, through atomic transmutation. It's not earthly science, it was created in another galaxy. There, Deirdre's race had slave people to energize the crystals. Doug, she's killed you! I'm not dead. I'm alive, Steve, more alive than I have ever been. All the crystals, Martians, Venusians, beings from other systems and galaxies that landed on this asteroid. Deirdre took them for her own, as she took Hastings, as she has taken me. We serve her now. The jewel tore free from Arnson's grip. It fled back to Circe, brushing her lips, caressing her hair. The other gems, scores of them, danced about the girl like elfin lovers. Arnson stood there, sick and nauseated. He understood now. The intricate crystal machines were too complicated to work unless life force energized them. Circe, who took the minds of living beings and prisoned them in silicate robot forms. They felt no resentment. They were content to serve. Damn you! Arnson mouthed and took a step forward. His fists balled. His fingers ached to curl about the girl's slender neck and snap it with sharp, vicious pressure. Her lashes swept up. Her eyes looked into his. They were black as space, with stars prisoned in their depths. They were not human eyes. Now Arnson knew why O'Brien had asked if he had looked into Deirdre's eyes. They were her secret and her power. Her human form was not enough to enchant and enslave the beings of 100 worlds. It was the soul-shaking alienage that looked out of Circe's eyes. Through those dark windows, Arnson saw the outside. He saw the gulf between the stars, and no longer did he fear it. For Circe was a goddess. She was above and beyond humanity. A great void opened between her and the man, the void of countless evolutionary cycles and 1,000,000 light-years of space. But across that gulf something reached and met and clung, and Arnson's senses drowned in a soul-shaking longing for Circe. It was her power. She could control emotion as she could control the crystals, and the power of her mind reached into Arnson and wrung sanity and self from it. Only in outer semblance was she even slightly human. Beside her, Arnson was an animal, and like an animal, he could be controlled. She blazed like a flame before him. He forgot O'Brien, forgot Hastings and Earth and his purpose. Her power clutched him and left him helpless. The grip upon his mind relaxed. Circe, confident of her triumph, let her eyelids droop. And Arnson's mind came back in a long, slow cycle, from the gulfs between the stars, drifted leisurely back into the crystalline cavern and the presence of the goddess, and woke. Not wholly, he would never be whole again, but he felt the crowding vibrations of the countless prisoners in crystals who had gone the way his own feet were walking now, bewildered, drunken, and drowning in emotions without name, sacrificing identity without knowing what they sacrificed, flung into eternity at the whim of a careless goddess to whom all life forms were one. She was turning half away as realization came back to Arnson. She had lifted one round white arm to let the crystals cascade along it. She did not even see him lurch forward. What he did was without thought. The emotions she had called up in him drowned all thought. He only knew that he must do what he did. He could not yet think why. The breath hissed between his lips as he stumbled forward and thrust Circe into the flame. From the roof, a grey jewel dropped. The tower of fire paused in its rhythm, beat out strongly again. From it a crystal leaped. It hung motionless in the air, and Arnson seized it with shaking fingers. He felt great racking sobs shake him. His fingers caressed the jewel, pressed it to his lips. "Circe!" he whispered, eyes blind with tears. "Circe!" Epilogue. Arnson had not spoken for a long time. Through the window I could see the Cairo stratoship being wheeled into place. Beyond, the lights of New York glowed yellow. "And so you came back," I said. He nodded. "And so I came back. I put on my spacesuit and went back to the ship. The crystals didn't try to stop me. They seemed to be waiting. I don't know for what. I blasted off and headed sunward. I knew enough to do that. After a while I began to send out SOS signals and a patrol boat picked me up. That was all." "Doug?" "Still there, I suppose. With all the others. Vale, why did I do it? Was I right?" He didn't wait for an answer, but cupped the little shagreen box in his hand. He didn't open it. "No," he went on. "You can't answer me. Nobody can. Circe took the soul out of my body, and I'm empty now. There's no peace for me on Earth, or in the spaceways. And out there, somewhere on that asteroid, the crystals are waiting for Circe to come back. But she will never come back. She will stay with me till I die, and then she'll be buried with me in space. In the meantime, Circe doesn't like it here on Earth, so I'm going out again. Sometime, perhaps I'll take her back outside, to the unknown place from which she came. I don't know." An audio announced the plane for Kansas. Arnson stood up, gave me a smile from his ravaged face, and without a word went out. I never saw him again. I think that beyond Pluto, beyond the farthest limits of the system, a little cruiser may be fleeing into the void, controls set, racing, perhaps, for the darkness of the coal sack. In the ship is a man and a jewel. He will die, but I do not think that even in death his hand will relax its grip on that jewel. And the ship will go on, into the blackness which has no name.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this compilation, hit the like button and subscribe for more. And if you want access to ad-free videos, audio-only versions to enjoy wherever you like, and narrations of full novels, make sure to sign up to my Patreon page at patreon.com/storiesfromtheskysff.